Clara Whitmore slammed her mother's recipe book onto the table so hard the tin cups rattled, and 3 cowboys flinched back from their seats. "You want to tell me I can't cook for working men?" Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't shake. Nothing about her shook, even though she hadn't eaten in 2 days, and her boots had a hole straight through the left sole. "Then fire me. But do it after you taste what I just made. Because I guarantee not one man in this room will stand up from that table." If this story already has your attention, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. I want to read every single comment telling me what city you're watching from, because this story has traveled further than Clara ever thought she would. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's find out together how far one woman's courage can reach. The morning Clara Whitmore arrived in Silver Creek, Texas, the temperature was already climbing past 90 degrees before 8 o'clock, and the dust from the road had turned everything the same flat color of dried bone. She stepped down from the wagon with her leather bag on one shoulder and her mother's recipe book pressed against her chest, like it was something she would fight a man to keep because she had already fought 3 men to keep it, and she would do it again without hesitation. The wagon driver didn't offer to help her down. He had stopped offering her anything after the second day of travel, when she had made it clear she wasn't interested in the kind of conversation he kept trying to start. He'd been civil enough after that, which was all she needed from him. She didn't need kindness from strangers. She had stopped expecting kindness from anyone. She stood in the road and looked at Silver Creek the way a person looks at something they've been warned about. The town was smaller than she expected, louder than she'd hoped, and it smelled like cattle, hot iron, and something faintly rotten beneath both. A general store, a saloon with a broken front window patched over with burlap, a livery stable with the doors hanging open. A church at the far end of the main road that looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint since Lincoln was president. 2 women in pale dresses crossed the street ahead of her without looking her way. A group of men sat outside the saloon in the shade watching her with the particular kind of attention that made her straighten her spine and look directly back at them until they looked away first. She had 43 cents in her bag. She had her mother's recipe book. She had the name of one man, Ethan Callahan. That was everything. 6 months ago, Clara had owned more than this. Not much more, but more. She'd had a home in New Orleans, a small restaurant her parents had built over 20 years of early mornings and late nights, a life that was worn and difficult and sometimes exhausting, but fundamentally hers. She'd had her father's laugh, her mother's handwriting filling pages of that leather-bound book, the smell of their kitchen every single morning. Without exception, the particular way the afternoon light came through the restaurant windows and turned everything golden for about 45 minutes before it disappeared. She didn't have any of that now. The fire had come in October, 3 days after her father died of a fever that moved so fast it didn't give anyone time to argue with it. Her mother had followed him 6 weeks later, and Clara had always believed it wasn't the grief exactly that killed her mother. It was the shock of discovering what grief felt like when you had spent 31 years building your entire world around one person, and that person was suddenly irreversibly completely gone. Her mother had simply had no practice being without him. Clara understood that. She understood it better every day. The restaurant had burned while she was still in the early disoriented weeks of mourning her mother, while she was still waking up every morning and reaching for a grief that felt too large to hold properly. Her father's younger brother, a man named Edmund Whitmore, who had visited the family exactly 4 times in Clara's entire life, and who smelled strongly of hair oil and weak character, had arrived within the week. He came with papers. He came with a lawyer. He came with the particular quiet confidence of a man who had already decided how a thing was going to go and simply needed the other person to sign in the right places. Clara had not signed. What happened after that was a long and ugly process that she did not like to think about in detail, but the essential truth of it was this: Edmund Whitmore had more money, more connections, and more willingness to do things that Clara found repulsive, and in the end, those advantages had been sufficient. She had walked out of a lawyer's office in New Orleans with the clothes on her back, her leather bag, her mother's recipe book, and 43 cents that Edmund's lawyer had apparently considered an acceptable settlement for a woman with no remaining male relatives and no deed recorded in her name. She had taken the 43 cents. She had taken the recipe book. She had walked out into the street and stood very still for approximately 1 minute while she decided whether she was going to cry or whether she was going to do something more useful. She decided to do something more useful. That had been 6 months ago. 6 months of moving from town to town across Louisiana and into Texas, following rumors of work the way other people followed rivers, because work was the thing that kept her moving, and moving was the thing that kept her from sitting down somewhere and not getting back up. She had cooked in boarding houses and cattle camp kitchens, and one extremely unpleasant week in a hotel that turned out to be something other than a hotel. She had been underpaid and overlooked, and talked down to, and on 3 separate occasions told that a young woman of her apparent quality ought to be looking for a husband rather than employment, as if those were 2 categories of activity a person could simply swap between based on practical convenience. She had left each situation when it became untenable and moved toward the next one. The name Ethan Callahan had reached her in a town called Marston, where she'd spent 2 weeks cooking for a boarding house whose owner paid her half of what they'd agreed, and considered this a reasonable outcome, because, as he explained, he hadn't expected the work to be quite so satisfactory, and now felt the original agreed-upon amount would have represented poor value for money on his part. She had collected what he gave her without argument, because arguing would have cost her more time than the difference was worth, and she had gone to sit in the small room she rented by the week and count her remaining money and think carefully about her next move. A woman named May Douglas had knocked on her door that evening. May was the boarding house's only long-term resident, a widow of about 60, who had sharp eyes and a habit of speaking without introduction or preamble that Clara found refreshing after months of men who needed 3 paragraphs to arrive at a single dishonest point. "You're leaving," May said. It wasn't a question. "Tomorrow morning," Clara said. "You have anywhere to go?" "Not yet." May sat down in the single chair without being invited, which Clara also found refreshing. "I heard you've been looking for kitchen work. Real kitchen work, not just boarding house cooking." "I'm not particular at this point. Callahan Ranch," May said, "about 40 miles east of Silver Creek. Biggest cattle operation in this part of Texas. Ethan Callahan runs it. Lost his cook about 3 weeks ago, man named Jenkins, who'd been there 12 years, just up and disappeared one morning without a word to anyone." Why would a man who'd been somewhere 12 years disappear without a word? May's expression shifted in a way that was interesting. That's the question people ask. The answer they come back with isn't usually one that makes the job sound particularly appealing. "Tell me anyway." "Ethan Callahan is a hard man," May said. "Not cruel. Nobody says he's cruel. But hard. Expects things done exactly so. Doesn't explain himself. Doesn't forgive mistakes the way most men will eventually if you wait him out." Jenkins was the best cook in 3 counties, and Callahan told him once in 12 years that the biscuits were acceptable. That was the highest praise Jenkins ever received in that kitchen. And Jenkins left because of that. Jenkins left because his sister in Kansas needed him, May said. But the story I just told you is also true, and you should hold both things in your head at once before you go riding out there. Clara thought about it. Is he fair? About wages? Yes. About everything else? May considered. He's fair in the way that a mathematical equation is fair. It doesn't take your feelings into account, but it doesn't lie to you either. That's fine, Clara said. I'm not looking for someone to take my feelings into account. I'm looking for work. May had given her the directions and a letter of introduction that turned out to be more valuable than Clara had anticipated, because May Douglas was apparently known throughout this part of Texas as a woman whose judgment could be trusted, and her letter was the difference between Clara getting through the front gate at all and being turned away at the road. She thought about that letter now as she walked through Silver Creek, looking for the road east toward the Callahan Ranch. She thought about what May had said. Hard, but fair. Didn't explain himself. Didn't forgive mistakes. She had met men like that. She had worked for men like that. What May was describing sounded to Clara like a man who had decided that disappointment was easier to manage if you simply didn't allow yourself to expect very much, and had built his entire manner around that decision. She understood that impulse better than she cared to admit. She found the road east and started walking. The Callahan Ranch announced itself before she could see it, the way large things sometimes do, not dramatically, not with any fanfare, but with a gradual accumulation of evidence. The fencing grew better. The cattle she saw through the fence were heavier and better kept. The road became less road and more something a person had actually maintained with intention. And then she came around a long curve and saw the ranch itself spread out below a low rise, and she stopped walking for a moment, not because she was tired, but because it was larger than she had imagined. Large, and she realized somewhat held together by will alone in certain areas. The main house was impressive. 2 stories good timber, a wraparound porch that someone had built with real care. But the bunkhouses needed paint. One of the fence sections along the near pasture had been repaired with wire that didn't match the original material, the kind of repair that spoke of urgency rather than planning. There were signs everywhere of a place that had more ambition than it currently had hands to execute that ambition. A place that was working hard and still falling slightly behind. She recognized that feeling intimately. The man at the gate was big, sunburned, and looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had been told to expect nothing good from strangers and had found this advice consistently validated by experience. "Help you," he said. "I'm here about the cook position," Clara said. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I have a letter of introduction from May Douglas in Marston." The name landed. She could see it land, a small shift around his eyes, a recalibration. "May Douglas sent you." She did. He looked at her for another moment, her bag, her worn boots, the recipe book she was still carrying pressed against her chest, because she hadn't found a convenient moment to put it in her bag where it would be safer. "Mr. Callahan doesn't generally see people without an appointment." "I understand that," Clara said, "but I've walked 40 miles in 3 days and I don't have money for a return trip to anywhere, so I'd be grateful if you'd at least deliver the letter." He thought about it. Then he held out his hand. She gave him the letter and waited. He was gone for about 8 minutes. When he came back, he opened the gate wider and said, "He'll see you in the main house," with a tone that suggested he found this outcome personally surprising. She followed him across the yard, past 2 cowboys who stopped what they were doing to look at her with frank curiosity, past a barn where she could hear horses moving and smell the particular combination of hay and animal warmth that she had always, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, found reassuring. The gateman knocked twice on the front door of the main house and then stepped back as if removing himself from whatever was about to happen. The door opened. Ethan Callahan was taller than she had pictured. He had the particular kind of leanness that comes from years of physical work rather than from not eating enough, and he had dark hair going silver at the temples, and his eyes were the flat, evaluating gray of a man who had taught himself to look at things rather than at people because things were more predictable. He held May Douglas's letter in his left hand, and he looked at Clara the way she imagined he looked at a piece of land he was considering purchasing, with complete attention and no particular expression. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Callahan. May says you're the best cook she's encountered in 20 years of running boarding houses." He let that sit for a moment. May Douglas is not a woman who says things she doesn't mean. "No," Clara said. "She isn't. She's also not a woman who sends people to me without reason." He glanced down at the recipe book she was still holding. "What's that?" "My mother's recipe book." He looked at it. He looked at her. "Your mother taught you to cook." "She did." "Where is your mother now?" "She died 8 months ago." Something crossed his face. Not quite sympathy, not quite discomfort, something in between that he dismissed quickly. "I'm sorry to hear it," he said, and it sounded like something a man says when he means it, but has had limited practice saying it. "Thank you," Clara said. He stepped back from the door. "Come in." The inside of the main house was the same as the outside, impressive in its bones, slightly worn at the edges. The home of a man who had built something substantial and then gotten so focused on maintaining it that certain details had been allowed to slide. The furniture was good, but dusty. The floors were clean but unpolished. It was a house that had once had more attention than it currently received, and it showed. He led her to a room off the main hall that served as an office, gestured at a chair, and sat behind a desk that was covered in papers, organized with a precision that suggested either a very orderly mind or a very anxious one. "I have 32 men to feed 3 times a day," he said without preamble. "The kitchen starts at 4:30 in the morning, and the last meal is served at 7 in the evening. There's no day off during calving season, which runs 6 weeks in spring. There is a half-day Sunday the rest of the year. The wage is $12 a month plus room and board." Clara did the arithmetic quickly. It was better than anything she'd been offered in 6 months. "I understand," she said. "My last cook was with me 12 years. He knew this kitchen, knew these men, knew what was needed without being told." Ethan's voice was completely level, as if he were reading figures from a ledger. "I'm not looking for someone to experiment. I'm looking for someone to perform a function reliably." "I can do that," Clara said. "You're younger than I expected. I've been cooking in professional kitchens since I was 14. I worked in my family's restaurant for 11 years. She held up the recipe book. "My mother learned these recipes from her mother. I've been making these dishes longer than most of your cowboys have been shaving." He looked at her steadily. "You're confident." "I'm accurate." Something shifted in his expression so small she almost missed it. It wasn't a smile. It was more like a recognition of something he hadn't expected to find. "All right, Miss Whitmore," he said. "I'll give you one dinner, tonight. You'll cook for 32 men with whatever's in the kitchen stores, and I'll judge the result. If it's satisfactory, we'll discuss a permanent arrangement. And if it's not satisfactory, I'll pay you for the day's work and arrange a ride back to Silver Creek." She nodded. "Fair enough." He stood, which apparently meant the meeting was over. "One of the hands will show you the kitchen." He paused at the door. "Miss Whitmore, the men here work hard. They're tired by evening. They need food that means something, not just food that fills a plate. If you can understand that distinction, you'll do well here. If you can't, no amount of technique will make up for it." He left before she could respond. She stood in his office for a moment, holding her mother's recipe book, and thought he understands something about cooking that most people don't understand. He just doesn't know he understands it. Then she picked up her bag and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was enormous and somewhat chaotic, with the particular disorder of a space that had been maintained by someone who knew where everything was and then abruptly stopped maintaining it, leaving everyone else to work around an organizational system that existed only in the absent person's head. There were cast iron pots large enough to cook for a small army, a wood-burning stove that was genuinely impressive, and had clearly been the pride of whoever installed it. Good shelves, reasonable stores of flour, dried beans, salt pork, potatoes, onions, and coffee. In the cold larder, she found a significant quantity of beef. Good beef. She noted the kind of beef that came from a man who ran a cattle operation, and therefore had access to better cuts than most people ever saw. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and turned slowly, cataloging everything, and her mother's voice said in her memory, clear as if the woman were standing next to her, "You can make a meal from almost anything if you understand what the person eating it actually needs." "What do they need?" Clara said aloud to the empty kitchen. She thought about Ethan Callahan's words. "They're tired. They need food that means something." She thought about her mother's restaurant in New Orleans, the kinds of people who came through, what they looked like when they walked in, and what they looked like when they left. Her mother had always said that a good meal didn't just feed a person's body. It reminded them that they mattered to someone, that someone had thought about them specifically, had taken the time and the care. She opened her mother's recipe book to a page she knew by heart and got to work. She had 4 hours before the evening meal. She used all 4 of them. The bread she started first because bread needed time, and she knew from years of experience that fresh bread, real bread, not the hard flat variety that most camp kitchens produced, could change the entire atmosphere of a room before a single other dish reached the table. While the bread was rising, she worked on the beef, a slow braise with onions, and the herbs she found hanging dried above the stove. a technique her mother had taught her for making tough cuts. Tender, and making tender cuts transcendent. She made 3 other dishes alongside, moving between them with the efficiency of someone who had cooked under pressure since childhood, who had learned to manage 5 things at once without losing track of any of them. A young ranch hand stuck his head in around 5 o'clock and stared at her for a long moment. "Smells different in here," he said. "Good different or bad different?" He thought about it with the seriousness of someone who had been asked a genuinely important question. "Good different. Real good different. What are you making?" "Supper," she said. "Could you tell me something? The men here, what do they miss most? What did they eat growing up that they don't get out here?" He blinked. Apparently nobody had ever asked him that. "My mama made a sweet potato pie," he said. "Haven't had it since I left home." "I don't have sweet potatoes," she said. "But I have something close. Tell the others supper's at 7, and they should come hungry." He left. She went back to her work. By the time the cowboy started filing into the dining hall at 7 o'clock, the smell that filled the space was so different from what they'd been eating for the past 3 weeks since Jenkins had left, and the cooking duties had fallen to whoever was least busy, which meant the food had been edible and nothing more, that several of them stopped just inside the door and stood still for a moment. The way people stand when something they weren't expecting suddenly demands their full attention. Clara stood at the end of the room and watched them come in. She had laid out the food in the way her mother had always laid out food for a large gathering, not in a line to be served from, but spread across the long tables. The way a family meal is laid out, so that people reached across each other, past things had to interact, couldn't just take a plate and disappear into their own silence. She had put the bread in the center, because the bread was, in her professional judgment, going to be what they remembered tomorrow. 32 men sat down. The first man who reached for the bread tore off a piece and put it in his mouth, and then stopped chewing for a full second, and looked at the bread in his hand, and then at Clara, and said, "Ma'am." "Go ahead," she said. The room filled up. Plates moved. Dishes were passed and passed again. And then a thing happened that Clara had seen happen in her mother's restaurant on the best nights. The nights when everything came together exactly right, the room went quiet. Not the quiet of unhappiness or boredom, but the specific quiet of people who are so completely engaged with something that conversation becomes temporarily unnecessary. 32 hard-worked, exhausted, generally fairly cynical cowboys ate Clara Whitmore's first meal at Callahan Ranch in almost complete silence, and then slowly the talking started. Not the usual talking, not the functional exchange of necessary information, or the brief arguments that characterized most mealtimes she'd witnessed at working ranches. Real talking, stories, laughter. A man at the far end of the table said something she couldn't hear from where she stood that made the 5 men nearest him laugh so hard, one of them had to set down his fork. 2 men who had clearly been in some kind of unspoken disagreement, she could tell by the careful way they'd positioned themselves on opposite ends of a bench, when they sat down, were deep in conversation over the remains of the braised beef, leaning toward each other, gesturing. She was clearing plates from the near end of the table when she became aware that someone had entered the room. Ethan Callahan stood in the doorway. He was looking at his men. Not at the food, not at Clara, at his men. At the way they were sitting, the way they were talking, the specific quality of the noise in the room. His expression was unreadable in its usual way, but she was already developing a sense for the smaller signals, the slight tension around his eyes, that meant he was more affected by something than he intended to appear. He stayed in the doorway for about 30 seconds. Then he walked to the end of the table nearest Clara, reached past her without ceremony, picked up a piece of bread and ate it. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her, and his expression did something complicated that she suspected his face didn't often do. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Callahan. Who taught you to cook like that?" She had the recipe book in the pocket of her apron. She touched it briefly through the fabric, felt the worn leather cover, the slightly raised edge of her mother's initials pressed into it 20 years ago. "My mother," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with those flat gray eyes that were, she was beginning to realize, not as flat as they initially appeared. "She taught you well," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "She did." He set down the remaining piece of bread and straightened. "The position is yours, Miss Whitmore, if you want it." She didn't hesitate. "I want it." "Good." He turned to go and then stopped. "The men will have questions tomorrow about who you are, where you came from. They'll be respectful, I require it, but they'll be curious." "That's fine," she said. "Curiosity I can manage." He almost did something with his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. 7 o'clock breakfast, he said. 4:30 start time, as discussed. I'll be ready at 4. He left. Clara stood in the nearly empty dining hall. The last few cowboys were drifting out now, a couple of them nodding to her as they went. One young man who couldn't have been more than 18 stopping to say, "Best meal I've had since I left Kansas, ma'am. I mean it genuinely," before disappearing into the evening. And she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she had to stop and identify it carefully. She felt for the first time in 6 months like she might be exactly where she was supposed to be. She picked up her mother's recipe book and held it in both hands and thought, "I found us somewhere to stay a little while, Mama. I think you'd like it here." Then she put it back in her apron pocket and went to clean the kitchen for tomorrow's 4:30 start, because the feeling was real, but the work was also real, and she had never in her life been a woman who confused the two. The bunkhouse was quiet by the time she finished. The main house was dark except for a single lamp in an upstairs window. Ethan Callahan, still awake, still working, she imagined. The kind of man who worked until there was nothing left to work on, and then got up and did it again. She recognized that kind of man, because she was in certain essential ways that kind of person. She found the small room off the kitchen, that had apparently been Jenkins's quarters, set her bag on the floor and her recipe book on the narrow shelf above the bed, and lay down in her clothes because she was too tired to do otherwise. She was asleep in approximately 45 seconds. She dreamed of her mother's kitchen in New Orleans, the afternoon light through those windows, the smell of something good on the stove. Her mother's voice saying clear and certain, "You see, I told you. Wherever you go, the food goes with you. And wherever the food goes, people follow." She woke at 3:50 in the morning, 10 minutes before she needed to, because she had always been the kind of person who woke before she needed to. She lit the kitchen stove. She opened her mother's recipe book to the breakfast section. And Clara Whitmore, who 6 months ago had been standing in a lawyer's office with 43 cents, and the clothes on her back, began building something in the kitchen of Callahan Ranch that she couldn't quite name yet, but that she recognized in the way you recognize something you've been looking for without knowing what it looked like, a place that wanted to become home. Outside, the Texas sky was still dark. Somewhere in the pastures, cattle moved and settled. The bunkhouse stayed quiet for another hour. And in the kitchen, the smell of good coffee and fresh bread beginning to rise filled the space and drifted out through the gaps in the door and reached one by one the sleeping men who would wake in an hour and come to the table and feel, without knowing quite why, that something had changed. Something had. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she had arrived with nothing but her mother's recipes and the determination to survive one more day. And she had already lasted the night, and she intended to last considerably longer than that. The next morning, Clara discovered something about Callahan Ranch that nobody had warned her about. The men didn't just have appetites, they had opinions. She had the biscuits out of the oven at 5:15 and the coffee ready at 5:20 and the eggs and salt pork done by 5:30. And when the first cowboys filed in at 5:45, she was ready, completely ready, standing at the end of the serving table with her mother's rhythm already in her hands. The particular efficiency that came from years of feeding people who needed to be somewhere else in 30 minutes. The first man through the door was the big one who'd been at the gate the day before. He stopped when he smelled the biscuits and said, "Lord Almighty," under his breath like a prayer. "Sit down," Clara said. "Everything's hot." He sat. 12 more men came through in the next 4 minutes. They came the way hungry working men always came to a meal, fast, purposeful, without conversation. finding their seats with the mechanical efficiency of people who had learned to eat quickly, because time was always the thing there was least of. But when the biscuits reached them, when the coffee went around, something slowed. Not the eating. The eating stayed fast the way men who worked from before dawn until after dark always ate fast. But the quality of the silence changed. It became a different kind of silence, appreciative rather than absent, Clara moved around the table refilling coffee and paying attention to everything the way her mother had taught her to pay attention at a table, not to the food, not to the logistics, but to the people. Who was eating with enthusiasm, and who was picking at things? Who was talking, and who had gone quiet for reasons that might not be about the meal at all? She had always believed that a kitchen gave you more information about the people you were feeding than almost any other kind of space, because eating was one of the last places where people forgot to perform. She noticed a young man at the far end of the table couldn't have been more than 19. The same one who'd told her about his mother's sweet potato pie the evening before eating his biscuit with the focused attention of someone who was trying to memorize something. Not just eat it. Memorize it. She went to refill his coffee and said quietly, "All right." He looked up. His eyes were slightly too bright. "My grandmother used to make biscuits like this," he said. "I hadn't thought about her in—" He stopped. "I don't know why I'm telling you that." "Because breakfast's the meal that does it," she said. "Every time. I don't know why either. It just is." He nodded, not trusting himself to say more, and went back to his biscuit. She moved on. That was the first mini-climax of the morning, and it told her something important. These men weren't just hungry for food. They were hungry for something that felt like home, and they had been hungry for it for a very long time, and the hunger was deeper than any of them had language for. She filed that information away and kept moving. By the time Ethan Callahan appeared in the doorway at 6 o'clock sharp, she was already learning his rhythms, the precise punctuality that seemed to govern every aspect of how he moved through his own ranch. The dining hall was loud. Not the argumentative loud of men with complaints, but the alive loud of men who had been given something they needed and were responding to it the only way working cowboys knew how, which was to start talking about everything else. Ethan stood in the doorway for 30 seconds, the same way he'd stood there the evening before reading the room. Then he walked to his usual place at the head of the table. She'd figured out which one was his usual place by the way every other man had unconsciously left it empty, and sat down without ceremony. Clara set a plate in front of him. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "You started the biscuits at what time?" 4:45. "The stove takes 20 minutes to reach the right heat from cold." "I know," she said. "I started the stove at 4. He looked at the biscuit again, picked it up, and ate half of it in one deliberate bite. Chewed. Set the other half down. "These are better than Jenkins biscuits," he said with the tone of a man issuing a geological survey rather than a compliment. "I know," she said again. Something crossed his face. It wasn't quite amusement. It was more like the recognition a person has when they encounter something they didn't account for in their original calculations. "You're very direct, Miss Whitmore." "You told me last night you needed someone reliable," she said. "Reliable people tend to be direct. It saves time." He looked at her for one long measuring moment. Then he picked up the other half of the biscuit. "Sit down," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. You've been on your feet since 4 o'clock. The men are served. Sit down and have your breakfast." He didn't look at her when he said it was already reaching for his coffee, as if the instruction was entirely practical rather than any kind of social gesture. She considered arguing. Then she considered that her feet actually did hurt, and that arguing with Ethan Callahan at 6 in the morning over whether she was allowed to sit down and eat was not a battle that had any clear upside. She sat. She poured her own coffee. She ate her own breakfast. Ethan didn't speak for the first 5 minutes, which she was beginning to understand was not rudeness, but simply his natural state, a man who considered words to be a resource that shouldn't be expended without reason. She matched his silence easily, because she had always been comfortable with silence. Had grown up in a busy kitchen, where quiet was something you grabbed when you could and held on to, and because she was still paying attention to the room, the way she always paid attention, cataloging, filing, building the picture. "The man at the end," she said finally. "Third from the left. He's not eating much." Ethan glanced down the table without appearing to move his head significantly. "Holt," he said. "He's been off his food for about a week. Is he sick?" "He got a letter from home 10 days ago." A pause. "His father died." Clara looked at Holt, the man in question, who was perhaps 40, with a weathered face and the specific stillness of someone managing something too large to put down and too heavy to carry comfortably. "Has anyone talked to him about it?" "He doesn't want to talk about it," Ethan said. "I offered him time off to go home for the burial. He said there was nothing left to go home to." She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to receive news of a death in a place like this, surrounded by men who were essentially strangers with no family and no familiar walls and no kitchen that smelled like anything your mother had ever cooked. She thought about the 6 weeks after her own mother died, the specific quality of that grief, the way food had tasted wrong for a long time. Not bad exactly, just wrong, like everything had been slightly mistranslated. "I'll make something for him tonight," she said. Ethan set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. "Miss Whitmore, you don't know that man. You've been on this ranch for approximately 15 hours. I know what it's like to lose someone and not have anywhere to put the grief," she said. "That's enough." He held her gaze for a moment that went on just slightly longer than a functional exchange required, and she had the strange sense that something was being evaluated. Not the practical competence he'd tested with last night's dinner, but something else, something with less obvious criteria. "All right," he said and looked away. That was the second thing she thought. The first had been the biscuits. The second was that Ethan Callahan, behind all that practical distance, was paying attention to his men in ways he didn't advertise, and he recognized when someone else was doing the same. She went back to her kitchen. By mid-morning, she had the lunch preparations running, and had found the organizational logic that Jenkins had apparently imposed on the kitchen stores not immediately obvious, but once she understood it, efficient. She reorganized 3 things that didn't make sense to her and left the rest alone. She was not the kind of person who changed things for the sake of changing them. The young man from the gate, she learned his name was Pete Alvarez, 22 years old, originally from San Antonio, 3 years on the Callahan Ranch. The longest tenured of the younger hands, appeared in the kitchen doorway at 10 o'clock. "Mr. Callahan said to ask if you needed anything from Silver Creek. He's sending a supply run." "Come in," she said. "Don't stand in the doorway. Stand." He came in with the slightly uncertain air of someone who wasn't sure of the new rules. "Jenkins didn't like people in the kitchen," he offered. "Jenkins isn't here," she said. "I don't mind people in the kitchen as long as they're not in my way." "Are you in my way?" He looked around, assessed his position relative to the stove and the preparation table, and moved 3 steps to his left. Better, she agreed. "Tell Mr. Callahan I need dried chilies, more salt pork, a quantity of sweet potatoes if they have them, and black-eyed peas if he can find them." Pete wrote it down with the seriousness of someone who understood that a supply list was not a document to be approximate about. Then he said without looking up from his writing, "Where did you come from, Miss Whitmore? Before here, I mean." "New Orleans," she said. "Before that, various places." "You're not from Texas." "No." "Jenkins was from Texas," he said. "Thought that mattered running a ranch kitchen, like you had to understand the land to understand the food." He finally looked up. "But last night was better than anything Jenkins ever made, and Jenkins was from Texas, so I'm revising my theory." She almost smiled. "What's your new theory?" "That it's got nothing to do with where you're from," he said. "It's got to do with whether you're paying attention." She looked at him with renewed interest. 22 years old, and already understanding something that most people twice his age never figured out. "That's exactly right," she said. "Now go give Mr. Callahan my list before he sends that supply run without it." He went. She turned back to her lunch preparations and thought about Holt. The man at the end of the table, who wasn't eating, and thought about what her mother would have made for a man carrying that specific weight, and decided on a beef stew with the kind of depth and warmth that took 3 hours to build properly, but arrived at the table like a conversation with someone who already knew your whole history without needing to be told. She started the stew. Lunch went the way breakfast had gone, which was to say it went well better than, well, it went the way a meal goes when the person cooking it is at the specific intersection of technical skill and genuine intention, when the food is not just correct, but considered. 2 more cowboys introduced themselves to her. A man named Garrett, who ran the cattle operations side by side with Ethan, and had the particular authority of a second-in-command, who knows exactly how much of the operation actually passes through his hands, came to her after lunch and said, "Ma'am, I've been on this ranch 11 years. Last 3 weeks have been rough on the men. What you did last night and this morning, I want you to know, we appreciate it." She appreciated him saying it because he clearly wasn't a man who said things lightly. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett." "Just Garrett," he said. "Nobody calls me Mr. anything." "Thank you, Garrett?" He nodded. Then, with the careful manner of someone raising a topic that required handling, "You know about the situation with the ranch." She kept her expression neutral. "I know Mr. Callahan runs a large operation and that he needed a cook. Beyond that, I don't know much." Garrett looked at her for a moment. "He'll tell you what you need to know when you need to know it," he said finally. "I just wanted you to be aware that things on this ranch are not as straightforward as they might look on the surface." "Most things aren't," she said. He left. She spent the afternoon between lunch and dinner preparation thinking about what Garrett had said and deciding that she would not press it. She had enough to manage without looking for additional complications, and she had learned that information came to people who waited in kitchens because kitchens were where people talked when they forgot to be careful. The evening meal was when everything shifted. She had put particular thought into the stew, for Holt had made it separately from the main stew. Same base, deeper seasoning, the kind of richness you built by slow attention rather than fast technique. And she placed it in front of him, specifically, rather than letting it come around the table with everything else. He looked at it. He looked at her. His face did something complicated. "That's got black pepper in it," he said. "And something else." "Bay leaf," she said. "And my mother used to add a small amount of something she called her secret ingredient, but it was actually just Worcestershire sauce, and she knew perfectly well I knew that." His face went complicated again, but differently this time. He picked up his spoon. She moved away and let him eat. 20 minutes later, she was clearing plates from the far end of the table when she heard his voice behind her. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. Holt was standing up, which in a room where everyone else was still seated gave him a certain gravity. His face was still carrying everything it had been carrying, but his plate was empty, and there was something in his posture that hadn't been there before, a very slight reduction in the particular stiffness of a man bracing against something. "Thank you," he said. "For—" He stopped, started again. "My father used to make a stew, on cold nights, before everything went wrong with our family." He stopped again. "I don't know how you knew." "I didn't," she said honestly. "I just made the kind of thing I'd want if I were sitting where you are." He nodded once with the careful dignity of a man who was not going to cry in the dining hall of a working cattle ranch and was exerting real effort to maintain that position. "It was real good," he said. "There's more," she said. "I made extra." He sat back down. Clara turned away quickly, because she had her own things to manage, in terms of not displaying emotion in professional settings, and this was, after all, a professional setting, even if it was also beginning to feel like something more than that. She was washing the last of the dinner pots when she heard boots on the kitchen floor, and knew from the pattern, even in 3 days, she was learning his pattern, the specific weight and cadence of it, that it was Ethan. "You made something different for Holt," he said. It wasn't a question or a criticism, just an observation stated flatly. "Yes," she said. "You spent extra time this afternoon." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. She kept washing the pot she was working on. She could hear him behind her, not moving, just standing. "Why?" he said finally. She set down the pot and turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and he looked tired in a way that was different from physical tired, a more structural exhaustion, the kind that accumulated over years rather than days. "Because he needed it," she said. "And I could provide it. Those are the only two conditions I require." He looked at her steadily. "That's not how this ranch operates, Miss Whitmore. This ranch operates on efficiency. Things that are needed, things that serve a function." "What I did tonight served a function," she said. "Holt ate a full meal for the first time in 10 days based on what you told me this morning. A man who eats well works better. A man who feels remembered by someone works better still." She picked up the pot again. "That's efficiency." He was quiet for so long she thought he was going to leave without responding. "Jenkins was here 12 years, he said at last. "He was a good cook, an excellent cook. He never once made something different for a specific man." "Then Jenkins was an excellent cook," Clara said. "I'm trying to be something more than that." She said it simply without drama, because it was simply true, and she had learned that the truest things were usually best delivered straight. Another long silence. Then, "The sweet potatoes Pete brought back from Silver Creek are in the cold larder." "I know. I put them there. There's also a pound of pecans he picked up on his own initiative. Said he thought you might be able to do something with them." She felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. "He was right. He usually is," Ethan said. "Pete's one of the best hands I have. Came here at 18 with no references and nothing but the claim that he worked hard and learned fast, and I took a chance on him because something about the way he presented himself convinced me he meant it." He paused. "That's one of the few things I've been right about lately." She looked at him. He was staring at a point on the kitchen wall that had nothing particular on it, but his voice had shifted into something more unguarded than she'd heard from him before, and she recognized this phenomenon the way a kitchen could do that to people. Make them say things they hadn't planned to say. Because there was something about the warmth and the smell of food and the low hour of the evening that lowered the usual defenses. "You're not usually wrong about people," she said carefully. He refocused on her, and the guard came back up, but not all the way. "I'm usually cautious enough that it doesn't come up," he said. "Lately I've been less cautious than usual, which is why the ranch is in the position it's in." She waited. He shook his head slightly, as if he'd said more than he intended to, and pushed off from the doorframe. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." "Good night, Mr. Callahan." He left. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment after his boots faded down the hall, holding a clean pot she'd forgotten she was holding, thinking about what he'd said. The ranch is in the position it's in. And Garrett's words from lunch things on this ranch are not as straightforward as they might look on the surface. She filed it away with everything else she'd collected that day and went to her room and lay down and was asleep in minutes, because whatever complicated thing was happening on this ranch, her part in it started at 4 o'clock in the morning, and that was enough to occupy her attention for now. The days that followed had a rhythm that she built herself the way she had built rhythms in every kitchen she'd ever worked in, finding the structure inside the chaos and making it consistent. She rose at 4, started the stove, had breakfast ready by 5:45. She sent Pete to town twice in the first week, with specific lists, and twice he came back with everything on the list, and 1 or 2 things he'd decided on his own that turned out to be exactly right. She started to think of Pete as something like an assistant, which she suspected he'd been hoping for without knowing quite how to ask. The Cowboys adjusted to her, the way working men adjust to a thing that is clearly an improvement, with initial wariness, then gradual acceptance, then a fierce protectiveness that announced itself in small ways. The man named Cole, who was roughly 60 and had been on the ranch longer than anyone except Garrett, told a visiting livestock buyer, who made a slightly inappropriate comment about Clara's age, that he could take his business elsewhere, and the ranch would get along fine without him, thank you. Clara heard about this from Pete 2 days later, and felt something warm settle in her chest. But it was the conversations around the table that were teaching her the most. She had started what she thought of as listening architecture, an arrangement of herself and the serving patterns that meant she was always within range of the conversations happening at the table's various nodes, the way a river has currents you can navigate if you understand the underlying geography. Not eavesdropping exactly, more like tending. She learned things. She learned that Ethan Callahan had expanded the ranch aggressively 3 years ago, taking on additional pasture land to the east under terms that had seemed favorable at the time, and now looked less so. She learned that a man named Victor Langley, who owned the neighboring ranch to the north, had been making comments in Silver Creek about Callahan's operation, nothing overtly hostile, but comments with edges, the kind designed to introduce doubt into a person's reputation before you gave them any specific thing to be doubtful about. She learned that 2 of Ethan's eastern fence lines were in dispute, the nature of which she didn't entirely understand, but which clearly mattered because every time anyone mentioned it at the table, voices dropped and eyes moved in a specific pattern that meant this was the real trouble. This was the thing underneath everything. She didn't ask direct questions. She listened. And she cooked. At the end of her first full week, Ethan called her into his office. She sat across from him, and he leaned back in his chair and studied her with those gray eyes that she was becoming fluent in the way you become fluent in a language you hear every day. "You've changed things," he said. "I've made dinner," she said. "Don't be modest, Miss Whitmore. It doesn't suit you." He said it without heat, as a simple observation. "Garrett tells me the men are more productive. Cole told me yesterday unsolicited that this was the best year he could remember working here, which is notable because Cole doesn't say things like that. The man who's been in debt trouble since February Newcomb. He came to me 3 days ago and asked about the possibility of an advance on his wages and actually explained his situation clearly, and with a plan, which is the first time in 8 months he's communicated like an adult human being about it rather than just avoiding me." Clara thought about Newcomb, the slightly desperate quality she'd noticed in how he ate the way he sat alone more than the others. "Did you give him the advance?" "I did, because he had a plan." He studied her. "You know something about him. I know he hasn't been sleeping," she said. "He drinks 3 cups of coffee at breakfast when everyone else drinks 2, and his hands shake a little until the second one hits. And he always sits near the door." She paused. "Men who are carrying debt shame tend to want an exit route close by. It's not rational, but it's common." Ethan was looking at her with an expression that she couldn't fully read, which was becoming a familiar experience. He had more layers than she'd initially assessed, which she supposed was true of everyone who had built something substantial over a long time. "Where did you learn to notice things like that?" he asked. "My mother's restaurant," she said. "She always said a restaurant was a study in human nature that people paid you to observe. She could tell within 5 minutes of a couple sitting down whether they were in love and trouble or somewhere between the two. She said the food they ordered and the way they ordered it told you everything. And the food you cook tells them something in return." "That's the idea," she said. "That's what cooking actually is if you do it right. A conversation." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife," he said, and then stopped as if the sentence had surprised him by beginning. She waited. "She died," he said. 5 years ago. She used to say something similar, that a meal was a form of care made physical." He said it with the specific flatness of a man who had been carrying something for so long that he had learned to reference it without inflection, because inflection cost too much. I had forgotten she said that until just now. The kitchen went very quiet. Not the dining hall quiet, the intimate still quiet of 2 people in an unexpected moment that neither of them had planned for. "I'm sorry," Clara said, because there was nothing else to say, and she believed in saying the true thing. "It was 5 years ago," he said, with the particular defensive mathematics of a person who believed that the passage of time should have made something smaller and was still surprised that it hadn't. "Doesn't matter how long ago it was," she said gently. "Some things don't do the math." He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he looked away out the window at some middle distance that was probably easier to look at than the expression she suspected was on her own face. "There's something I should tell you about the ranch," he said, changing direction with the decisiveness of a man closing a door he'd accidentally left open. About the situation with the Eastern land. I've heard some of it, she said. Around the table. He refocused on her sharply. What have you heard? Victor Langley, she said. Fence disputes. 3 years of expansion that looks different now than it did when you decided to do it. His jaw tightened. The men shouldn't be discussing that. They weren't discussing it with me, she said. They were discussing it with each other, and I happened to be there. She paused. Mr. Callahan, I'm going to be in that dining hall 3 times a day, every day. I'm going to hear things. I can pretend I haven't, or I can be useful with what I learn. I'd rather be useful. He looked at her for a very long time. Victor Langley wants the eastern pasture, he said at last. He's claiming that the deed I hold on it is defective, that there was a prior agreement between his family and the previous landowner that gives him a claim. His lawyer is in Austin. My lawyer is in Silver Creek. He said these 2 facts in a way that communicated very clearly how he assessed the respective strength of those positions. He's been working the political angle for 4 months. If he succeeds in getting the territorial court to hear his claim, the odds are not in my favor, regardless of what the actual deed says. Because his lawyer is in Austin, she said. Because his lawyer is in Austin, he agreed. She thought about this. She thought about Edmund Whitmore and his lawyer in New Orleans, and the papers he had arrived with, and the particular confidence of a man who had already arranged the outcome before he knocked on your door. She knew exactly what this felt like from the other side of it, and she knew that the feeling was accurate, that money and connections did in fact influence outcomes, in ways that justice was supposed to prevent, and frequently didn't. He's going to come here, she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan's expression shifted. He's already requested a meeting. Next week. Here at the ranch. He suggested it. I agreed because I won't give him the satisfaction of meeting him on neutral ground and having him interpret it as weakness. She nodded slowly. Then I'll make sure the meeting happens in the dining hall. He blinked. I beg your pardon? If the meeting is going to happen here, she said, it should happen in the dining hall. Over a meal. Victor Langley will walk in expecting to intimidate you in your own home, and instead he'll walk into a room full of men who belong here eating food that tells them they belong here, and he'll be the one who doesn't fit. She leaned forward slightly. A man who's trying to take something from you has an advantage when you meet him one-on-one behind closed doors. He loses that advantage when you put him in a room where everything reminds him that this is your place, not his. Ethan stared at her. That, he said slowly, is not what I expected you to say. What did you expect me to say? Something about the menu. She smiled, and it was a real smile, one that surprised her slightly by how easily it came. I'll take care of the menu too, she said. That part goes without saying. He looked at her with the expression she was starting to think of as his recalibration expression. The look of a man encountering something he hadn't accounted for in his original assessment of a situation. She had seen it on his face several times now. She suspected she would see it again. Miss Whitmore, he said, how is it that you arrived at my ranch 10 days ago with a worn leather bag and 43 cents? He stopped. She went very still. How did you know about the 43 cents? Pete told me. Pete had it from the gate man who had it from you when you came through. He said it without apology. I like to know what I'm dealing with. She held his gaze. And what are you dealing with? He was quiet for a moment. The lamp on his desk threw a warm, unsteady light across his face, and in it he looked less like a man made of calculation, and more like a man made of the same materials as everyone else, tired, uncertain, carrying more than he showed. Honestly, he said, I'm not entirely sure yet, but I think... He stopped again. Then, with the deliberate honesty of a man who had decided to say the true thing, at the cost of saying the careful thing, I think you might be exactly what this ranch needs, and I'm not certain I know what to do with that. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she stood up. You don't have to do anything with it, she said. I'll be in the kitchen at 4 tomorrow morning. That's enough for now. She walked out of his office, back through the dark hall toward the kitchen and her small room beyond it, and she could feel his eyes following her until she turned the corner and disappeared. Outside, the Texas night was enormous and very quiet, the sky full of more stars than she'd ever seen in New Orleans. And somewhere in the pastures, the cattle moved with the slow, settled certainty of things that knew exactly where they were and had no interest in being anywhere else. She thought, I don't know what's coming with Victor Langley. I don't know what's going to happen with those fence lines, or that Austin lawyer, or any of the things I've been hearing around that table. But I know what I'm going to cook next week when he comes. And I know that whatever this man is building here, whatever he's trying to protect, I am no longer simply a cook in his kitchen. She went to her room. She opened her mother's recipe book. She started planning the menu for the most important dinner Callahan Ranch had ever served. Victor Langley arrived on a Tuesday, which Clara had not expected. Ethan had said next week, and she had understood next week to mean Thursday or Friday at the earliest, because men who wanted to project power tended to make you wait for them, tended to let the anticipation build until you'd exhausted yourself with preparation, and they could walk in fresh while you were already tired. So when Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway at 10 o'clock Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands, and an expression that meant something had changed, Clara already knew what he was going to say before he said it. "He's here," Pete said. "Rode in 20 minutes ago with 2 men and a lawyer. Mr. Callahan is asking if you can move the midday meal earlier." Clara set down the knife she was holding. She looked at the stove, looked at the preparation table, looked at the state of everything she had started that morning with Thursday in mind. "How much earlier?" she said. "Noon." She had 2 hours. "Tell Mr. Callahan noon is fine," she said. "Tell him to keep Langley in the yard until then." Pete hesitated. "Is there anything I can do?" She looked at him. He was leaning forward slightly with the eager helpfulness of a young man who had decided she was worth protecting without quite being able to articulate why. "Yes," she said. "Go find Holt and tell him I need him in this kitchen in the next 15 minutes. And tell Cole that I need the good table linen, not the everyday. He'll know where it is." "Jenkins never used the good linen," Pete said. "Jenkins isn't here," she said, and turned back to the stove. She heard him leave at a run. She stood still for exactly 10 seconds, which was the amount of time she allowed herself to feel the pressure of what she was about to do, and then she moved. Her mother had once said that the best meals she ever produced were the ones she had to make under impossible conditions, because impossible conditions burned away everything unnecessary and left only the essential question. What does this person need, and what is the fastest way to get it to them? Clara had always found that her mother was right about most things, and she found it again now in the Callahan Ranch kitchen with 2 hours and a man coming to take everything Ethan had built. Holt appeared in 14 minutes, still wearing his work gloves. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the controlled chaos she'd already put in motion and said, "What do you need? Can you peel potatoes fast?" "Fastest man on this ranch," he said without any particular pride, just as a statement of available fact. "Then wash your hands and sit down," she said. He sat down. He peeled potatoes. He didn't ask questions, which she appreciated more than she could have said. Cole appeared 10 minutes after Holt, with the good table linen folded over one arm, and an expression on his face that was both helpful and deeply interested in whatever was happening. Cole was 62 years old and had the particular intelligence of a man who had watched a great many situations develop from close range and knew what the signs meant. He set the linen on the end of the preparation table and said without preamble, "Langley came early on purpose." "I know," Clara said. "He's done it before. Shows up before people are ready and reads the disorganization." "He's not going to find any disorganization today," she said. Cole looked at her steadily. Then he looked around the kitchen at Holt peeling potatoes with focused speed at the 3 things already on the stove at the precision with which everything was moving, and something settled in his expression that looked like the specific satisfaction of a man whose confidence in something has just been validated. "No," he said. "I reckon he's not." He picked up the linen. "I'll set the table." He left. She cooked. She had made this kind of meal before. Not this exact meal, but this category of meal, the kind that had to do a specific job beyond feeding people, the kind where the food itself was an argument. Her mother had called it cooking with intention, by which she meant not just that you were paying attention, but that every choice you made was in service of something larger than the plate. The beef she'd started that morning was already good. She adjusted the seasoning to make it exceptional. The bread she'd planned for dinner she moved to noon. The sweet potato dish she'd been saving for Sunday she made now because she wanted Victor Langley to sit at Ethan Callahan's table and eat food that announced quietly, but without any possibility of misunderstanding, that this ranch was a place where people were cared for, and that caring for people was a form of power that a man like Langley had probably never thought to cultivate. At 11:45, Pete came back. "They're getting restless out there. Tell Mr. Callahan 5 more minutes," she said. Pete went. She plated the first round of dishes. She straightened the kitchen. She untied her work apron, hung it on the hook by the door, and put on the clean apron she kept for exactly this kind of occasion. Not spotless, because spotless in a working kitchen implied that you hadn't actually been working, but clean and pressed and deliberate. She walked to the dining hall doorway and looked at what Cole had done with the good linen and felt a complicated pride in it, because Cole had understood the assignment without needing it. Explained the table was set, the way you'd set it. If you wanted someone to understand immediately that they'd walked into a place that knew the difference between a meal and a performance. "It's ready," she told Pete. He went to get them. Victor Langley was not what she had expected, which was itself the first useful piece of information. She had pictured from the things she'd heard around the table a large and overtly aggressive man, the kind that led with volume and physical presence. The man who walked into the Callahan Ranch dining hall was medium height, well-dressed in a way that was precise rather than expensive, with a face that had been arranged probably since early childhood into an expression of pleasant reasonableness that didn't reach his eyes. He had 2 men with him who were there to be large and present. He had a lawyer who was a small, neat man with a document case who positioned himself immediately at Langley's left in the manner of someone who had learned to be useful without being visible. Clara watched all of this from the serving end of the room. Langley looked at the table. He looked at the linen. He looked at the food that was already arranged there, not served yet, but present the smell of it filling the room with the particular authority of a meal that has been made well and knows it. And then his eyes moved to Clara, and stayed there for a moment with an assessment that she recognized and had encountered many times, and had developed a very specific response to, which was to look directly back and let the silence make itself useful. "Mr. Callahan," Langley said, turning to Ethan, "you've added to your staff." "Miss Whitmore runs my kitchen," Ethan said. The flatness in his voice was not the uncertain flatness Clara had initially misread. It was the deliberate flatness of a man who had decided not to give a particular person any more tone than necessary. "A woman," Langley said with the particular emphasis of someone who considers this observation to be an argument complete in itself. "A cook," Ethan said. "Sit down." Something flickered behind Langley's pleasant expression, the first indication that the table and the food and the clean linen were doing exactly what she'd intended them to do, which was to put him in the position of sitting at someone else's table and accepting someone else's hospitality before he'd gotten around to his real business. A man who arrives to take something from you has a psychological advantage when the conversation happens in an office or a yard. He loses that advantage the moment he sits down to eat your food, because eating someone's food is at some very fundamental level accepting their care. And accepting care put a person in a different position than they'd planned for. Langley sat. His 2 men sat. His lawyer sat setting the document case carefully at his feet. Ethan sat at the head of the table, and Garrett sat to his right. And the positioning was not accidental. Garrett was the kind of physical presence that reminded people without saying anything that this was a working ranch full of working men, not an office in Austin where documents and connections were the only currency that mattered. Clara served. She served with the same manner she brought to every meal-competent, unhurried present without being intrusive. She refilled water. She brought the bread first because the bread was the thing that did the most work fastest. She watched Langley take a piece out of courtesy and eat it, and then without appearing to mean to reach for a second piece. She filed that away. The conversation across the table was careful on both sides. The particular careful conversation of two men who each know the other's position and are observing social forms before moving to the actual conflict. Langley made remarks about the ranch, complimentary remarks delivered with the slight distance of a man who is complimenting something he intends to acquire. Ethan responded with the precise minimum. Garrett said almost nothing, but was watching Langley's lawyer with the focused attention of a man cataloging information. Clara moved around the table, and she listened. Not to the main conversation, she was already familiar with the shape of that one. She listened to the things around it. The way Langley's two men talked to each other in brief low exchanges when they thought nobody was paying attention. The way Langley's lawyer opened the document case and closed it again, a gesture repeated 3 times in 20 minutes that spoke of either anxiety or habit. The way Langley himself, when he thought Ethan was engaged with something else, looked at the room not with the acquisitive look of a man pricing property, but with something older and more personal than that. She was at the far end of the table, clearing plates when she heard it. Langley's lawyer, speaking very quietly to one of the large men, said something that included the words, "Patterson deed," and "before the county clerk's records were transferred," and then dropped his voice further, and the rest was inaudible. Clara straightened. She moved toward the kitchen with the plates. She set them down. She stood still for a moment with her hands flat on the preparation table and thought about what she'd just heard. Patterson deed, before the county clerk's records were transferred. She didn't know enough about land law in Texas to know exactly what that meant, but she knew enough about the way men talked when they were doing something legitimate versus the way they talked when they were doing something that required the record to be in a particular state at a particular time to make sense. She had heard Edmund Whitmore's lawyer talk. She recognized the register. She went back to the dining hall. Langley had moved from pleasantries to business. She could tell by the change in the room's temperature, not literal temperature, but the specific shift in how people held their bodies when a conversation moved from social to serious. Ethan was very still. Garrett had his hands flat on the table. Langley's lawyer had opened the document case. "The agreement between my father and Samuel Patterson," Langley was saying with the smooth confidence of someone delivering a prepared statement, "predates your deed by 18 months, Mr. Callahan. It was a private arrangement not recorded at the time, but there are witnesses." "There are 2 witnesses who are employees of your ranch," Ethan said. "That's not the same thing as independent witnesses. The law doesn't require independence," Langley's lawyer said, speaking for the first time in a voice that was professionally mild. "Only attestation." "The law," Garrett said, his first words of the whole meal, "also requires that the agreement be in writing to be enforceable against a recorded deed." Langley's lawyer paused, just briefly. "There is a written document." "Produced when?" Ethan said. Another pause, shorter this time, but present. "The document was always in existence." "That's not what I asked," Ethan said. "I asked when it was produced. When did this document enter the record?" Clara was at the end of the room. She was holding a serving dish. She was paying absolute attention. Langley's lawyer said the document was entered into the county clerk's record in March. "Of this year," Ethan said. "Of this year," the lawyer confirmed. "The county clerk's records for this district," Garrett said, "were transferred from the old office to the new courthouse in February. During which time there was a period of approximately 3 weeks, during which the records were in transit and not fully supervised." The room was very quiet. Langley's pleasant expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something tightened. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr." "I'm not implying anything," Garrett said. "I'm noting a timeline." Ethan looked at Langley. "Your document appeared in the clerk's record in March, 3 weeks after the clerk's records were unsupervised during transit." "That is a coincidence," Langley said. His voice had dropped 1 register toward something less pleasant. "Might be," Ethan said. "My lawyer is going to have a conversation with the county clerk about that coincidence." Langley set down his fork. The pleasantness was still on his face, but it had become effortful, which was the most interesting thing she'd seen him do. "Mr. Callahan, I came here today in good faith to discuss a resolution that would benefit both our operations. I'd hate for this to become adversarial." "It became adversarial," Ethan said, "when your lawyer filed a motion with the territorial court 2 weeks ago. I'm simply catching up to a timeline you've already set." Clara moved to refill the water glasses, and as she passed behind Langley's chair, she saw what he was doing under the table that nobody else could see from where they sat. His right hand flat against his thigh, pressing down with a sustained pressure that was the only physical evidence that the conversation was not going the way he'd planned. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at her preparation table and breathed carefully and thought. Patterson deed. Records in transit. A document that appeared in March when the records had been unsupervised in February. And then something else surfaced from the listening she'd been doing all week, a conversation between two of the older cowboys, overheard from the far end of the dining hall 3 days ago. Something about Samuel Patterson's nephew, who had come through Silver Creek a few months back and been drunk at the saloon, and said things about his uncle's land, and Langley's family, and a paper that his uncle had never signed and wouldn't have signed. A paper that his uncle never signed. She went back to the dining hall. She refilled the water glasses in order, methodically working down the table. When she reached Ethan's glass, she leaned slightly closer than she needed to, because the geometry of the serving motion made it natural, and she said in a voice pitched only for him, "Patterson's nephew. He was in Silver Creek a few months ago. Ask Cole." She straightened. She moved on. She did not look at Ethan's face. But she heard the conversation at the table take a turn 2 minutes later, when Ethan, with a smoothness she found genuinely impressive, shifted the discussion to the Patterson family's history with the land, in a way that was general enough to seem like casual context, but specific enough to tell Langley that the territory was not as clear as he'd mapped it. And she saw Langley's hand on his thigh press down harder. The meal ended. Langley and his men left with a parting exchange of courtesies that had the hollow sound of a conversation where both parties know the truth of the situation. Ethan walked them to the gate. Garrett stayed at the table, and when Clara came to clear the last of the dishes, he was sitting very still with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. "Patterson's nephew," he said. "Not a question. I heard 2 of the men talking earlier in the week," she said. "I don't know if it's useful. I don't understand enough about land law here." "It could be very useful," he said. "If Patterson's nephew has information about the document being forged." He stopped. "Did you hear anything specific about what he said?" "That his uncle never signed it," she said. "And wouldn't have." Garrett stared at her for a long moment with an expression that was difficult to interpret. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, "how long have you been paying attention to what's said around that table?" "Since the first morning," she said honestly. He let out a slow breath. "And you've been collecting it." "I've been listening," she said. "The same way I listen to everything. I didn't know it was going to be useful. I just didn't see the point in not paying attention." He was quiet for another moment. Then he nodded once with a finality that felt like a decision. "I'm going to find the nephew," he said, "before Langley does." He got up and left. Clara cleared the table. She was washing the good linen by hand. It couldn't be washed any other way when Ethan came back into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway and looked at her with an expression that was entirely different from any she'd seen on him before. Not the evaluative look, not the careful neutrality, not even the unguarded tiredness she'd caught once or twice in the evenings. This was something rawer than any of those. "You told me to talk to Cole," he said. "I told you to ask Cole," she corrected. "About the nephew." "Same thing." "Not quite," she said. "Asking implies you're still deciding what to do with the information. Telling implies you've already decided." He looked at her for a long moment. "When did you hear it?" 3 days ago, she said. Around the table. 3 days ago? He said it slowly. "And you've been carrying it since then." "I wasn't sure it was relevant until today," she said, "when I heard the lawyer mention the Patterson deed and the timing of when it appeared in the records." She kept her hands in the wash basin, kept moving, because the work steadied her, and she needed steadying right now with him standing in the doorway, looking at her with that expression. It might mean nothing, but it seemed like the kind of thing you should know. If the document was forged, he said, and the nephew can attest that his uncle never signed it, then Langley's entire claim collapses. I know, she said. That's why I told you. He was very still. She could feel his attention the same way you feel a change in the weather, a pressure, a shift in the air. How are you this calm about it? He asked. She looked up from the basin. I'm not calm about it, she said. I'm busy. There's a difference. Something happened to his face. Something she hadn't seen before. Not quite the recalibration expression, but adjacent to it, a kind of yielding in the lines around his eyes, a slight shift in how he was holding his jaw. The expression of a man who is used to carrying things alone, encountering the unexpected relief of not having to. When I hired you, he said, I thought I was solving a problem with breakfast. And now, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp on the shelf threw its unsteady warmth across the kitchen. And outside, she could hear the ranch settling into evening, the distant cattle, the sound of the bunkhouse door. Now, he said, and then stopped. She waited. Now I'm not sure what I hired, he said at last. But I think it might be the most important decision I've made about this ranch in 5 years. She looked at him steadily. You hired a cook, Mr. Callahan. Everything else I've been doing is just what happens when you pay attention. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said very quietly, My wife used to say something like that. He didn't look away. She said that caring for people was just paying attention made practical. Clara felt the weight of it, the way he'd said it, the specific choice to say it, which was not accidental from a man who was careful with every word. She thought about the 5 years he'd been running this ranch alone, eating dinner at the head of his own table, in a room full of men who were his employees and not his family, building and maintaining and fighting and protecting, and never once having anyone stand in a kitchen doorway and hand him a piece of information that might save everything. She thought he is lonelier than he knows how to say. She thought, I know what that's like. She didn't say either of those things because this was not the moment for them. Instead, she said, Then she was a perceptive woman. She was, he said. She was the most perceptive person I've ever known. A pause. Until possibly recently. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara turned back to the wash basin. Garrett's going to find the nephew, she said, returning them both to practical ground, because practical ground was safer for both of them right now. When he does what happens next, I take it to my lawyer, Ethan said. If the lawyer believes it's sufficient, we file to have the document examined for authenticity. If it was forged during the period, the records were in transit, there may be enough to... He stopped. It won't be fast, and it won't be certain. Langley has resources. So do you, she said. Money resources, he said. That's not the same as Austin resources. No, she said. But you have something Langley doesn't. What's that? She pulled her hands from the wash basin and dried them on a cloth and turned to face him. 32 men who would do anything for this ranch, she said, and a cook who listens. He looked at her. The look went on for long enough that she felt it in her chest, a particular pressure that she identified carefully and then set aside for later consideration because there were more urgent things to manage. Go talk to Cole, she said. Tonight before the men settle in. He'll know where to find the nephew. Ethan nodded. He pushed off the doorframe. He took 2 steps toward the hall and then stopped. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Callahan. He turned back. His face had the careful, stripped-down look of a man about to say something he had decided after considerable internal argument to actually say. I haven't thanked you, he said, for what you did today, the meal, the table, what you heard and what you told me, all of it. You don't need to thank me, she said. This is what I'm here for. No, he said. Your wages cover the cooking. What you did today is something else. She looked at him. What do my wages not cover? She said. Tell me. He was quiet for a moment. The part where you care about what happens to this place, he said. The part where you care about what happens to these men. He paused. The part where you listened to two cowboys talking about a drunk man in a saloon and kept it for 3 days because you thought it might matter someday. He shook his head slightly. That's not a job, Miss Whitmore. That's something different. She felt the truth of it land somewhere deep in a place she hadn't fully known was still open. My mother always said, she said carefully, that you can't cook well for people you don't care about. That the caring is what makes the food real. She paused. I think she was right about that. And I think it extends further than the kitchen. He held her gaze for one long, still moment. I think, he said, that your mother was an extraordinary woman. She was, Clara said. I'm still learning to be half of what she was. He looked at her, and this time what crossed his face was so open that it almost startled her, a look of recognition so direct it had no room for the usual management or distance. I don't think, he said quietly, that you need to be half of anything. He left before she could respond. She stood in the kitchen with the washed linen dripping over the edge of the basin, and her hands still, and her heart doing something she hadn't given it permission to do. Outside she could hear his boots crossing the yard toward the bunkhouse, toward Cole, toward the next thing that needed doing. Always moving, always working. The same relentless forward motion she recognized from her own life, the particular momentum of a person who had discovered that stopping was more dangerous than whatever was ahead. She picked up the linen and wrung it carefully and hung it to dry. She started the preparations for tomorrow's breakfast, because tomorrow came at 4 o'clock whether she was ready for it or not, and she intended to be ready. But underneath the practical motion, underneath the efficiency and the habit and the controlled competence, something was shifting. Something had been shifting since that first night in the dining hall, since the moment he'd picked up that piece of bread and looked at her and asked the question that had changed everything. But she hadn't let herself name it, because naming things made them real, and real things had consequences. And she was not a woman who moved toward consequences without thinking them through carefully. She was thinking now. She was thinking about a man who had spent 5 years building walls because grief had taught him that walls were safer than windows, who ate every meal at the head of a table full of people, and was nonetheless entirely alone, who said things in kitchens at low hours of the evening that he clearly hadn't planned to say, and then carried the weight of having said them back to his office and didn't sleep. She was thinking about what her mother's recipe book had always told her, without using words, that the purpose of a meal was to remind people they mattered to someone. That the act of cooking for someone was the act of saying clearly and without ambiguity, I see you. You are worth the effort. She wondered if Ethan Callahan had been genuinely seen in 5 years. She suspected the answer was no. She suspected that was something she was going to have to think very carefully about for reasons that were no longer entirely professional. But not tonight. Tonight there was Garrett riding toward Silver Creek to find a dead man's nephew and a forged document and a case that might save everything. Tonight there was Victor Langley somewhere calculating his next move, because men like Langley didn't absorb a setback over a dinner table and go home and reconsider. They regrouped and came back from a different angle, and she needed to be paying attention when they did. Tonight there was bread to prepare for 4 o'clock, and 32 men to feed tomorrow and a kitchen to run. She ran it. And in the morning, when Ethan came through the dining hall at 6 o'clock exactly, and sat at the head of his table, she set his coffee in front of him, and their eyes met briefly across the steam of it, and something passed between them that neither of them named, but both of them felt settling quietly into the space between them, like something that had decided it belonged there and intended to stay. Cole caught her eye from the far end of the table and gave her the smallest nod she'd ever seen, barely a movement at all, but deliberate from a man who had been watching people for 62 years and knew what he was looking at. She looked away and went back to work. But she was smiling, and she didn't stop herself. Garrett came back from Silver Creek on Thursday morning, and Clara knew something had happened before he said a word, because he rode in at a speed that wasn't his usual speed, and he went straight to the main house without stopping to unsaddle his horse, which meant whatever he was carrying couldn't wait for the ordinary sequence of things. She was in the kitchen when she heard the hoofbeats. She went to the doorway. She watched Garrett swing down, toss his reins to Pete, and disappear through Ethan's front door without knocking. Pete looked at her across the yard. "That's either very good or very bad," he said. "Go find out," she said. He went. She went back to the stove and kept working because the work was the one thing she could control, and the next 40 minutes were not going to cook themselves. But she was listening the way she always listened, and when she heard the main house door open again 20 minutes later and 2 sets of boots cross the porch, she put down her spoon. Ethan came into the kitchen first. Garrett was behind him. Both of them had the specific look of men who have just received news that is simultaneously better and worse than what they expected, which Clara had learned to recognize as the most dangerous kind of news, because it complicated things in ways that simple bad news didn't. "Close the door," she said to Garrett. He closed it. "Pete found Thomas Patterson 2 days ago in a town called Redbud," Garrett said. "About 30 miles east of here. He'd been drinking, but he was coherent enough." He paused. "He says his uncle Samuel Patterson never signed any agreement with Langley or with Langley's father. He says his uncle specifically refused to twice because Langley's father wanted the water rights included, and Samuel Patterson said he'd sell the land before he'd give up the water. So the document is forged," Clara said. "Almost certainly," Garrett said. "But here's the problem." He looked at Ethan. "Thomas Patterson is also in debt, significant debt, to a man in Redbud who turns out to be connected to Langley's business interests." The kitchen was quiet. "Langley got to him first," Ethan said. "It wasn't a question." "Not exactly," Garrett said. "Langley didn't approach him directly, but the debt exists, and Thomas Patterson is aware that if Langley's claim on the eastern pasture succeeds, the settlement money would be enough to clear his debt. He's not being paid to lie. He's being given a reason to stay quiet." "There's a difference," Clara said. "A legal difference," Garrett agreed. "But a practical one, too. A man who's staying quiet for financial survival is harder to move than a man who's been bought outright. He's not a villain. He's desperate." Clara turned that over. She knew what desperate felt like. She knew the specific calculations a desperate person made the way survival narrowed your options until they looked like they'd always been narrow, until you forgot there had ever been more room to move. "Is he going to testify?" Ethan asked. "He said he doesn't know," Garrett said. "Which means he's considering it, but he's scared. He asked for 2 days to think." 2 days, Ethan repeated. "He's not a bad man," Garrett said. "He's just in a bad position." "How much is the debt?" Clara asked. Both men looked at her. "Approximately $200, Garrett said. "Can the ranch cover $200? She asked Ethan directly. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes." "Then cover it," she said. "Not as a payment for testimony, not as anything he has to feel indebted for. Tell him it's a loan at no interest payable when he's able, and mean it." Ethan was very still. "You want me to loan money to a man I've never met, who is currently the only witness who can save my ranch?" "No," Clara said. "I want you to help a desperate man because he needs help and you're able to give it. What happens after that is between him and his conscience." She held Ethan's gaze. "There's a difference." She was deliberately using Garrett's own words back at him, and from the slight shift in Garrett's expression, she could see he recognized it. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You believe he'll testify if we help him. I believe that a man who is given a reason to believe that decent people exist is more likely to behave decently himself," she said. "I believe that's generally true. I also believe that it's the right thing to do regardless of the outcome." She paused. "But yes, I think he'll testify." Ethan turned to Garrett. "Go back to Redbud today. Take the money. Tell him exactly what Miss Whitmore said. A loan, no interest, no conditions payable when he's able. Tell him Callahan Ranch doesn't buy witnesses. Tell him what we need is the truth, and we'd be grateful to have it, but it's his decision." Garrett nodded. He picked up his hat. He looked at Clara one more time with that expression she'd seen before, the one that said he was continuously updating his assessment of her and consistently finding it insufficient. "Ma'am," he said. "Bring him back with you if he'll come," she said. "He shouldn't be sitting alone in Redbud while Langley's people are close by. Garrett left. The kitchen was quiet again. Clara turned back to the stove. She was aware of Ethan still standing in the room, that specific awareness she'd developed of him over the past weeks. The way you become sensitive to the presence of something that matters. $200, he said. You have it, she said. That's not what I meant. He came to stand at the preparation table, not close, just closer than the doorway. I meant you solved it. Just like that. I didn't solve anything, she said. Garrett found Thomas Patterson. You have the means to help him. Thomas Patterson will make his own decision. I just said the obvious thing. It wasn't obvious to me, he said. 5 minutes ago I was trying to calculate how to force testimony from a reluctant witness. You made me see the whole problem differently in about 30 seconds. She looked at him. You were thinking like a man protecting property, she said. I was thinking like a person. His jaw tightened, but not with offense, with something more complicated. Is that a distinction you'd make to most employers? No, she admitted. But most employers don't have Thomas Patterson's situation, and Victor Langley's timeline, and $200 all in the same room at the same time. She turned back to the stove. Also, you're not like most employers. What am I like? He said, and she could hear in his voice that the question was more serious than it sounded. She thought about how to answer that honestly. You're like a man who built something real, she said finally. Who knows what it cost and what it's worth? Who treats people fairly, even when fairness is harder than the alternative? She paused. You hired me when you had no reason to, except that May Douglas's letter said I was worth a chance. You gave Newcomb an advance when he finally came to you honestly. You gave Holt space to grieve without making him perform recovery on a schedule. She kept her hands moving, kept the practical work going alongside the words. You're a hard man, Mr. Callahan, but you're a fair one, and fair men are rarer than you'd think. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones she'd learned so far. Not the evaluative silence, not the exhausted silence, not the guarded silence of a man managing what he revealed. Something softer than all of those. My wife said I was hard, he said quietly. She said it the same way you did, like it was an honest description rather than a criticism. It is, Clara said. She also said... He stopped. Then, with the deliberate quality of a man making a decision, she said the problem with building walls is that you eventually forget which side of them you're on, whether you're protecting something inside or keeping yourself out. Clara was very still. She was right, he said. She sounds like she was, Clara said carefully. She would have liked you, he said. She would have found you in the kitchen the first morning and had your entire history out of you by noon and considered it a perfectly reasonable way to spend a Tuesday. Clara felt something warm and painful at the same time, the particular sensation of a kindness that costs the person giving it something real. That sounds like it would have been a gift, she said. Having someone like that. It was, he said. It was the greatest gift I ever had, and I didn't know it with sufficient completeness until it was gone. His voice was entirely steady, which she had come to understand meant the emotion was large rather than small. He steadied when things mattered, went flat when they were ordinary. 5 years is a long time to know something clearly that you only understood in retrospect. Yes, she said, simply, without adding anything, because this was the kind of thing that didn't need anything added to it. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him move, not toward the door, just a shift of weight, a small restlessness. Clara, he said, and then stopped. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She felt it in her chest, a small, sharp thing. Yes, she said again. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, which I know you will regardless of whether I ask for it, but I'm asking anyway. She turned from the stove and looked at him directly. Ask. When you came to this ranch, he said, did you intend to stay? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. No, she said. I intended to survive the winter. I intended to find a position that would hold me through the cold months and reassess in spring. He nodded. And now, she looked at him. She looked at the kitchen around her kitchen now organized in her way with her mother's recipe book on the shelf, where she put it every night and every morning took it down again, with the small marks she'd added to the storeroom inventory in her own handwriting, alongside Jenkins's faded notations with the cup hook she'd added herself, because there hadn't been one in the right place, and she'd needed one. She looked at all the small ways she had made this space hers without quite making the decision to do so, and she felt the weight of what that meant. Now, she said slowly, I'm not thinking about spring. He held her gaze. Something settled in his face, not relief exactly, but adjacent to it the look of a man who has been braced for an answer and received a different one than he'd prepared for. Good, he said quietly. And then before either of them could do anything complicated with that, I'll be at dinner. He left. Clara turned back to the stove and stood there for a moment, with both hands on the edge of it, feeling the warmth of the iron, grounding herself in the practical and the immediate, because the alternative was to stand in the middle of her kitchen and feel things she wasn't yet sure she had permission to feel. She cooked. She cooked the best dinner she'd made since the first night, because the situation called for it, because Garrett was riding to Redbud with $200, and her instinct was either going to hold or fail. And either way, the men coming to that table tonight needed to eat something that reminded them they were worth caring about. Garrett came back the following evening. He came back with Thomas Patterson. Clara saw them ride in from the kitchen window and felt the tension that had been living between her shoulder blades for 2 days, release in a single long breath. She kept her hands on what she was doing. She didn't go out. But she heard the voices in the yard. Ethan's, Garrett's, and a third one rougher, careful, the voice of a man in an unfamiliar place trying to read the situation he'd walked into. 20 minutes later, Pete appeared in the kitchen with wide eyes and the expression of someone carrying news that was too large for his face to fully contain. He's here, he said. Thomas Patterson. He's in the main house with Mr. Callahan and Garrett and a man from the lawyer's office. I know, she said. How does he look? Pete considered. Scared, he said. But like the kind of scared that's made its decision and is just waiting to get through what comes next. That's the right kind of scared, she said. Go tell them dinner is at 6 and they're all welcome at the table. Including Patterson. Especially Patterson, she said. Pete went. She thought about what Thomas Patterson was sitting with right now, the weight of going against something. The specific fear of becoming the kind of person who stands up when it's costly, which is a different and harder thing than wanting to be that person in the abstract. She had been that person in the lawyer's office in New Orleans, and she knew what it felt like, the clarity and the terror of it together. She added an extra dish to the dinner. Something sweet, something that said, you did a hard thing, and it matters. She'd found that people needed food to say certain things that words couldn't manage efficiently. Dinner that night was the strangest meal Callahan Ranch had hosted since her arrival, which was saying something given the Victor Langley meal 2 days before. 32 cowboys, 1 ranch owner, 1 foreman, 1 lawyer's representative, and Thomas Patterson, who sat next to Garrett, with the careful, slightly overwhelmed expression of a man who'd expected to be received with suspicion and had walked into a room that simply made space for him, the way a good meal does, without fanfare or conditions. He was about 50, with the weathered hands of a man who worked land and the eyes of someone who had been disappointed more times than he'd budgeted for. He ate Clara's dinner the way people ate when they were somewhere between grateful and undone. And when the sweet dish came around, he looked at it, and then looked up and found Clara at the end of the room. Who made this? He asked Garrett. Miss Whitmore, Garrett said. She runs the kitchen. Thomas Patterson looked at Clara across the room. Ma'am, he said, this is my mother used to make something like this, before she passed. I'm glad, Clara said simply. And she was. After dinner, she overheard, didn't eavesdrop, simply was present in the way she was always present, the conversation in the hallway outside the dining hall. Ethan and Thomas Patterson standing close enough that she could hear them through the partly open kitchen door as she cleared. "You didn't have to help with the debt," Patterson said. "I want you to know I understand it wasn't a bargain," Ethan said. "I meant what Garrett told you." "I know," Patterson said. "That's why I'm here." A pause. "My uncle was an honest man. He worked that land 30 years and he never once went back on his word, even when going back on it would have been easier. The idea that his name is on a document he didn't sign." His voice went tight. "I can't sit with that. I tried to sit with it and I can't." "Tell the lawyer what you know," Ethan said. "Everything. From the beginning." "I will," Patterson said. "I'll tell him what my uncle said about Langley's father. And I'll tell him that my uncle's signature doesn't look like that document shows, and I'll tell him everything else I know." He paused again. "It might not be enough." "It might not be," Ethan agreed. "But it's the truth, and right now, the truth is what we're short on." Clara heard them walk away down the hall. She stood in the kitchen and felt something she had no precise name for, a sense of things moving in the right direction, but slowly, with the fragile momentum of things that could still go wrong at any step, the way a meal could come together perfectly, and then something could fail at the last minute that ruined everything. She said a private, informal word to her mother, or to whatever of her mother remained accessible, and went back to washing dishes. The next 2 weeks moved in a rhythm that was tenser than anything she'd known on the ranch so far. Thomas Patterson made his statement to Ethan's lawyer, a thin, precise man named Aldridge, who came out from Silver Creek and spent 4 hours with Patterson in the main house and left with the expression of a man who had received more than he'd expected. Garrett rode to Silver Creek twice more. Ethan sent 2 telegrams that Clara knew about only because Pete mentioned them, and she did not ask their content, because she had learned precisely where the boundary was between helpful attention and intrusion, and she stayed on the right side of it. But she could see it in how Ethan ate. A man's relationship with food told you more about his internal state than almost anything else. She had known this her whole life, but the weeks of watching Ethan Callahan at his own table had made it into something close to a science. When things were going well, he ate with focus, present, efficient, occasionally pausing to comment on something or ask a question present in the room. When things were difficult, he ate faster mechanically, his attention elsewhere. And when things were genuinely precarious, he ate very little and drank more coffee than was good for him, and his jaw had a set to it at breakfast that said he had been awake for most of the preceding night. For the first 4 days after Patterson's statement, he ate very little and drank too much coffee. On the 5th day, something changed. He came to breakfast with a different quality to his stillness. Not the taut, watchful stillness of a man waiting for something to go wrong, but the particular settled quality of a man who has received information and has made peace with his next step. He ate his entire breakfast. He refilled his coffee once, which was his usual amount. Clara was refilling the general coffee around the table when she reached his cup, and he looked up at her with those gray eyes and said simply, "Aldridge found something." She waited. "The signature on this Patterson document doesn't match Samuel Patterson's signature on his property deed from 1871, Ethan said. "Not close enough. Aldridge has an expert who does document authentication for the territorial court. He looked at both yesterday and put his assessment in writing." He paused. "And Langley's lawyer filed a motion 3 months ago to have the clerk's transit records sealed. The motion was denied, but Aldridge found the filing. It means someone on Langley's side was trying to prevent exactly the examination we just conducted." Clara set the coffee pot down carefully. "So they knew the transit records were the vulnerability." "Which means they knew the document was inserted during that period," Ethan said. "Which means they know they forged it." "Can you prove they know?" "The filing is evidence of intent," he said. "Combined with Patterson's testimony and the signature analysis, Aldridge believes we can have the document invalidated and potentially move to a fraud charge against Langley." He said it with the flat precision of a man reporting facts, but underneath the precision, she could hear something she had not heard in his voice before: relief. Real relief. The kind that comes when the thing you've been protecting survives. "Ethan," she said, and then stopped because she'd used his first name and hadn't meant to, or hadn't decided to, or hadn't realized she was doing it until it was already done. He looked at her. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it. "It's all right," he said quietly. "You can call me that." She held his gaze for a moment. Around them, the dining hall moved on. Pete was saying something to Holt. Cole was refilling his own coffee with the independence of a man who had decided his relationship with the coffee pot was personal. Newcomb was eating steadily with the focused calm of a man whose specific weight had been lifted, and who was still adjusting to what it felt like to breathe normally. "I'm glad," she said. "About the document." "So am I," he said. "About more than the document." He looked at her in a way that she felt entirely from somewhere central. And then he looked back at his plate and finished his breakfast, and she picked up the coffee pot and moved on around the table. But she was careful not to smile, because Cole was watching and Cole would store it, and she wasn't ready yet for Cole to have that information. The legal proceedings moved quickly after that, which Aldridge attributed to the clarity of the evidence, and Garrett attributed to Langley's lawyer being smarter than Langley, and recognizing a losing position when the documentation was set in front of him. The fraud charge was filed. Langley denied everything with a confidence that was louder than it needed to be, which experienced people generally understood as a sign. The territorial court ordered an examination, and then Langley made his mistake. He came back to the ranch, not for dinner this time. Not with the careful, pleasant, reasonable face and the positioned men and the lawyer with the document case. He came in the middle of a working morning unannounced through the main gate that Pete had the bad luck to be standing near, and he came with a different energy than he'd had before, the energy of a man whose plan has started to unravel and who has not yet adjusted his strategy from the version that was supposed to work. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard raised voices in the yard. She went to the doorway. Langley was standing 15 feet from Pete, who had not let him pass the inner fence, which was correct. 2 of Langley's men were with him. And Langley's voice, stripped of the pleasant, reasonable management, was doing something very different from what it had done at the dinner table. "You tell Callahan," Langley was saying, "that he has made a serious error in judgment. He has made accusations that—" "Mr. Langley." Ethan's voice came from the direction of the barn, and she turned her head and saw him walking across the yard with Garrett behind him, and she noted that both of them had the specific quality of men who had seen someone coming before, that someone knew they were being seen. "I didn't expect you." "I'm sure you didn't," Langley said, and now the pleasant reasonable was back, but thinner, the way a coat of paint looks on wood that hasn't been properly prepared. "I thought we should speak directly without lawyers." "My lawyer advises against direct communication while the proceedings are active," Ethan said. "But you know that. Your lawyer would have told you the same thing." "My lawyer," Langley said, and a very interesting expression crossed his face, "has recently made it clear that he considers our position more complex than initially assessed." "I'll bet he has," Garrett said. Langley's eyes moved to Garrett with a look that carried more heat than he probably intended to show. Then they moved to Clara, standing in the kitchen doorway, and stayed there. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "You're still here." "I live here," she said. Something about the simplicity of it, the complete, undefensive calm of a woman saying, "I live here," the way you'd say the sky is blue, made something shift in his expression. He looked at her for a moment with what she could only describe as recalculation, the same expression she'd been seeing on Ethan's face since the first week, except on Langley it was sharper and less honest. "You've made yourself very comfortable," he said, and the way he said it was designed to make comfortable sound like a word with a dirty underside. "She's my cook," Ethan said. His voice was very quiet. "And she's under my roof, and you'll speak to her with respect, or you'll get off my land before I help you do it." The yard was absolutely silent. Langley looked at Ethan. Something happened between them in that silence. Not an argument. Something older and more direct than an argument. The kind of communication that happens between men who have run out of the social forms and are speaking the truth of the situation plain. "You can't win this, Callahan," Langley said finally, and now the pleasant reasonable was entirely gone, and what was left was just a man who wanted something and was used to getting it. "I have connections in Austin that—" You had connections in Austin, Ethan said. Your lawyer has spent the last 3 days distancing himself from the motion to seal the clerk's transit records. I'm told he's going to be very cooperative with the court's examination. He took one step forward. Your connections in Austin are reconsidering their positions, Mr. Langley. Because that's what Austin connections do when the documentation starts to look like fraud. Langley's jaw was tight. You can't prove anything about who. We can prove the document is forged, Ethan said. Everything else follows from that. He held Langley's gaze without any visible effort. Get off my land, talk to your lawyer, and then get yourself a better one, because you're going to need it. Langley looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara again, and this time what was in his face was something she recognized from Edmund Whitmore, the look of a man adjusting to the fact that a person he had not taken seriously had been in retrospect the problem all along. He left. His men followed without a word. The yard was quiet. Ethan turned. The men who had gathered at various points during the confrontation, Pete Cole Newcomb. 3 others from the bunkhouse who'd heard the voices were all watching him with the particular attention of men who have just seen their captain do something that reminded them why they're working for that captain. Back to work, Ethan said. Not harshly, just clearly. They went. He walked to the kitchen doorway. Clara stepped back from it, and he followed her inside, and she went to the stove because she needed to be doing something with her hands. He's scared, she said. Yes, Ethan said. Scared men do things that men who still have options don't do, she said. He came here without his lawyer and without a plan because he's starting to react instead of act. That means the evidence is working. Aldridge thinks we'll have a ruling on the document within 2 weeks, Ethan said. If the court validates the authentication analysis. They will? She said. He looked at her. You're very certain. The evidence is clear, she said. And Thomas Patterson is going to hold. How do you know? Because he ate 2 helpings of the sweet dish at dinner, she said. A man who's going to back out doesn't eat 2 helpings. He eats nothing and he leaves early. Ethan stared at her for a long moment. I cannot determine whether you're entirely serious. I'm entirely serious, she said. Food tells you things. I've been telling you that for weeks. Something happened in his face. A sequence of things actually moving through too fast to fully catalog, and then settling into an expression that was warmer than anything she'd seen from him yet. Clara, he said. Don't, she said. He blinked. Don't what? Don't say whatever you're about to say in the kitchen in the middle of a working morning when I have 32 men's lunches to manage, she said. Say it when it's time to say it. He was quiet for a moment. How will I know when it's time? She looked at him over her shoulder. You'll know, she said. You're smarter than you let on. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him come. Is that your professional assessment? It's my personal one, she said. Go to work. He went. She cooked. She cooked lunch for 32 men and 1 ranch owner who came through the dining hall at noon and ate his entire plate and didn't drink 3 cups of coffee. And she thought the tide is turning, and he feels it, and I feel it, and even the food knows it, because the food always knows. The ruling came in 11 days. Aldridge rode out personally to deliver it, which told Clara before he opened his mouth that it was the result they'd hoped for because lawyers who carry bad news tend to send a letter. She watched from the kitchen doorway as Aldridge handed Ethan the document in the yard. Watched Ethan read it. Watched Garrett read it over his shoulder. Watched the particular stillness that came over both of them, the specific quality of relief in men who have been carrying tension for so long that its absence doesn't feel like relief, but like the sudden awareness of how heavy the thing was. Ethan looked up from the document. He looked directly at the kitchen doorway. He looked directly at her. And she felt it the full weight of his gaze. The thing he had been not quite saying for weeks, the thing that had been building in the space between them, across every meal, every kitchen conversation, every quiet evening, in which they had both been more honest than they'd planned to be. She felt it the way you feel weather changing entirely and in your whole body. She nodded at him. Small, certain. He nodded back. And then Cole appeared at her elbow from nowhere, the way Cole always appeared from nowhere, and said with the supreme satisfaction of a 62-year-old man whose read of a situation has been confirmed over the course of several weeks, told Garrett first day that woman was the best thing that ever came through that gate. "Cole," she said. "Ma'am?" "Go set the table for dinner," she said. "Use the good linen." He grinned a full, real grin, the kind that transformed his weathered face into something much younger. "Yes, ma'am," he said and went. That night she made the dinner of her life. Not because the ingredients were the finest she'd ever had, not because the technique was beyond anything she'd attempted before, but because she understood, standing at that stove, that she was cooking for people who had come through something together, and the meal needed to carry that, needed to say, without any words you held. You were tested, and you held. The dining hall that night was the loudest she'd heard it. Not the careful, managed noise of the first weeks. The honest noise of men who felt safe enough to be themselves, who had stopped performing contentment and started experiencing it. Newcomb laughed at something Cole said, with a fullness she hadn't heard from him before. Holt and Pete were deep in a conversation that had the animated quality of people building something together in words. Thomas Patterson, who had stayed at the ranch for the past 2 weeks, at Ethan's quiet insistence and Clara's practical one, because she had simply continued setting a place for him at every meal, was sitting between Garrett and one of the younger hands, with the loosened look of a man who has done the hard thing and found that the other side of it is livable. Clara moved through it all and felt it, every bit of it. The warmth of a room that had become what she had been trying to make it since the first night, a place where people knew they mattered. She was clearing the far end of the table when Ethan appeared at her elbow, which was notable because he never helped clear the table. Had never once done it. It wasn't something she'd have expected him to do. He picked up 2 plates. She looked at him. "I know how to carry dishes," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That's not what I was looking at." "What were you looking at?" She looked at the room, at all of it, at the men and the noise and the warmth and the good linen, and Thomas Patterson laughing at something for the first time, and Pete watching the whole room, with the proud satisfaction of a young man who understands he is somewhere worth being. "All of this," she said. He stood next to her and looked at it with her. And she felt his arm along hers, not quite touching close enough that she was aware of the warmth of it, and neither of them moved away. "You built this," he said quietly. "We fed it," she said. "There's a difference. They built it themselves." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I said I'd know when it was time." She felt her breath change. "Yes." "I think this might be the time," he said. She turned and looked at him. This man who had spent 5 years building walls and had, over the course of a few weeks, been slowly and consistently reminded that walls kept you from things worth having. He was looking at her with all of it on his face, everything he'd been managing and containing and being careful with, and it was the most honest face she'd ever seen on him. "What were you going to say?" she asked. "That morning in the kitchen, when I told you not to say it." He held her gaze. Around them, the noise of the dining hall continued, 30-some people eating and talking and living the ongoing vital noise of a place that had found its warmth again. "That I don't know how this happened," he said. "That 3 weeks ago, I was a man managing a legal problem and a kitchen vacancy, and now I'm—" He stopped. "That you came here with 43 cents and a recipe book, and somehow you have become the most important thing on this ranch." He paused. "And that terrifies me. And I am grateful for it anyway." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Ethan," she said. "Yes." "I came here to survive the winter," she said. "I told you that." "You did." "I'm not thinking about spring," she said. "I told you that too." "You did," he said. She looked at him steadily. This woman who had walked through fire and loss and 40 miles of Texas road with a worn-out pair of boots and her mother's handwriting, and the determination to survive one more day, who had arrived at a gate with nothing and built something she had no word for yet, but that felt increasingly like everything. "Then I think," she said, "that you can say the rest of it whenever you're ready." He looked at her. Something in him, some last careful thing he'd been holding in reserve, let go. "I'm ready," he said, and the dining hall moved around them warm and loud and alive, full of men who had been given back their sense of belonging by a woman with a recipe book and a determination to pay attention. And Ethan Callahan stood next to Clara Whitmore in the middle of all of it, and felt for the first time in 5 years like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He said the rest of it the next morning. Not in the dining hall, not in his office, not in any of the places where they'd had the conversations that had been building toward this one. He said it in the kitchen at 5:45 in the morning before the men came in for breakfast, when it was just the two of them and the sound of the stove and the smell of biscuits that were 4 minutes from done. Clara was at the preparation table. She heard him come in, knew the weight of his step, now the way she knew the weight of everything in this kitchen by feel rather than by looking. And she didn't turn around, just kept working, because working steadied her, and she needed steadying this morning for reasons she hadn't fully examined yet. "Clara," he said. "4 minutes on the biscuits," she said. "I'm not here about the biscuits." She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with his hat in his hands, which she had never once seen him do. Ethan Callahan was a man who wore his hat with the ease of someone who had worn one since boyhood, who barely registered it as a separate object from himself, and the fact that he was holding it said something about the state he was in. "I've been awake since 3 o'clock, he said. "I know," she said. "I heard you walking at 4. He blinked. "You heard me." "Your room is above the kitchen," she said. "You walk when you're thinking. You've done it 4 times since I arrived, but never before 4:30. She held his gaze. "Last night you started at 3. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing the fact that she knew his rhythms, that precisely, that the woman in his kitchen had been tracking the specific pattern of his insomnia, the way a person tracks weather, because it mattered to her. "You didn't sleep either," he said. "No," she admitted. "The same reason?" She looked at him steadily. "Probably." He took 1 step toward her, then stopped with the careful manner of a man who has planned what he wanted to say and is now standing in the actual moment and discovering that planning and doing are 2 completely different activities. "I told you last night I was ready," he said. "You did." "I meant it," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm not a man who says things and then reconsiders in the morning. I've reconsidered plenty in my life, but not this." He paused. "Not you." She felt the words settle into her specific and real, each one landing where it was meant to. "Tell me what you want to say," she said. "Just say it plainly. You're good at plain when you decide to be." He took another step. He was close enough now that she could see the lines around his eyes, the ones that came from years of squinting against Texas sun, and the other lines, the ones that came from 5 years of managing grief and land and 32 men alone, without anyone to say the hard things back to him. She had spent weeks learning his face, and she knew all of it now, every layer of it, and she found that she loved what she knew. She noticed the word arrive in her own mind and let it stay. "When my wife died," he said, "I decided something. I decided that the risk of losing someone that way, of building something with another person and then having it taken, was a risk I wasn't going to take again. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it was efficient running a ranch that size alone, not having something to lose that way." He stopped. "I believed it for about 4.5 years. And the last 6 months," she said. "The last 6 months I've been lying to myself," he said. "And doing it badly." He held her gaze. "And the last 3 weeks I've given up lying entirely, which is why I was awake at 3 o'clock. "Ethan," she said. "Let me finish," he said. "I've been working up to this since approximately the second morning you were here, and I found myself looking for a reason to come back to the kitchen before breakfast was even done. And I need to say it before I lose my nerve, which is not something I generally admit to having. But apparently, You found the one specific area where I have it." She pressed her lips together. She was not going to smile. This was not a smiling moment. She was doing very well. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not as my cook, or also as my cook, because you're the best cook I've ever encountered. And I'm not going to pretend that isn't its own significant factor. But not only as my cook." He stopped. He looked at the hat in his hands. He looked back up. "I would like you to stay as the person you've been becoming on this ranch. The person who listens and feeds people and fixes things I didn't know were broken and tells me when I'm thinking like a man protecting property instead of a person." He paused. "The person I walk toward when something happens that I need to think clearly about. The person I thought about at 3 o'clock in the morning when I should have been sleeping." She looked at him for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Ethan?" she said. "Yes." "You just used 47 words to say something that has a much shorter version." He looked at her, and then for the first time fully without restraint, he smiled. It transformed his face, completely moved through it, like light moving through a room, and she thought, there it is. There's the man he's been keeping inside all those walls. Clara Whitmore. He said, "I am asking you to build something with me. Not just a kitchen, not just a ranch, something." He held her gaze. "I think you know what I mean." She did know. She had known for weeks. She had been knowing it and not letting herself know it, fully holding it at a careful distance, because she was a woman who had learned that the things you reach for without looking can disappear when you look directly at them. But she was looking now directly at it, and it was still there, solid and real, and warmer than anything she'd let herself have in 6 months of surviving. "My mother's recipe book," she said. He blinked at the apparent change of direction. "Yes. There are 43 pages in it," she said. "Recipes, my grandmother taught her recipes. She developed herself recipes. She wrote down because she was afraid she'd forget them recipes. She wrote down because she wanted me to have them." She paused. "The last page, the very last one, she left blank. I used to ask her why, and she'd say she was saving it. I asked her for what, and she said she'd know when the time came." She looked at him steadily. "She died before she filled it." He was very still. "For 8 months I couldn't look at that blank page," she said. "It felt like an absence, like a thing she meant to give me that she ran out of time to give." She reached into her apron pocket and took out the recipe book, worn leather soft from years of handling, and held it. "But I've been thinking about it differently lately. I've been thinking that maybe she left it blank on purpose. Not because she ran out of time, because she knew I'd need somewhere to start something new." She held his gaze. She held the book. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." The biscuits were done. She could smell them hit the exact right moment, that precise peak between nearly done and perfectly done, that you could only learn from years of practice, and she turned to the oven without thinking about it, because the training was in her hands, and she took them out, and they were perfect. She heard Ethan let out a breath behind her that sounded like something releasing that had been held for a very long time. "I was afraid," he said quietly, "that you were going to say no." "I know," she said. "You were doing the math on it. I could tell." She set the biscuits on the rack and turned back to him. "For a man who's good at math, you were doing it wrong. The probability was never what you thought it was." He looked at her. "What was the probability?" "Very high," she said. "Since about the 2nd week." Something crossed his face. Wonder, she thought, which was not a word she had previously associated with Ethan Callahan, but which fit perfectly, and she filed it where she would know where to find it. "The men will be here in 8 minutes, she said. "I know." "Put your hat on." He put it on. "Sit down and eat breakfast," she said. "And tonight after dinner, we can talk about what comes next without a time limit." He sat down. He ate breakfast. He ate 3 biscuits, which was 1 more than his usual. And he didn't try to hide that he was doing it. And Clara thought that was probably the most honest thing she'd seen him do yet. What came next unfolded over the following weeks with the particular quality of things that have been coming for a long time and arrive when they finally do with a sense of rightness rather than surprise. They talked in the evenings after dinner, and after the kitchen was clean and the ranch was quiet, the way people talk when they've decided to be honest and have discovered that honesty, once you start, has a momentum of its own. He told her about his wife, about the 23 years of their marriage, about what it had been like to build the ranch alongside someone, and then continue building it after she was gone, which was not building at all, but rather maintaining, holding the shape of something that had lost its animating force. He told her what it had cost him. He told her plainly without drama, because he was a man who communicated plainly once he'd decided to communicate, and she sat across the kitchen table from him and listened. The way she listened to everything completely without interruption, without trying to fix what didn't need fixing. She told him about New Orleans. She told him about her parents' restaurant, the real version. Not the summary she'd given when she first arrived, but the whole of it, the particular smell of the kitchen in the morning. Her father's laugh, her mother's hands moving through bread dough with the specific efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times and still found meaning in every repetition. She told him about Edmund Whitmore and the lawyer and the 43 cents, and she told it without bitterness, but also without softening it, because it was the truth. And the truth was what had brought her here, and she would not diminish it by making it smaller. Ethan listened the way she had taught him to listen, the way she'd been teaching him, without either of them naming it as teaching, with his full attention, and without trying to solve it before she was done. "Your cousin," he said when she had finished. "My uncle's son," she said. "Edmund Whitmore. He took everything. He took everything that could be taken," she said. "He couldn't take my mother's recipes. He couldn't take what I already knew." She looked at the recipe book on its shelf. "He thought he was taking everything. He was actually just redirecting me." "To hear," Ethan said. "To hear," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to help you do something about that," he said carefully. "Legally. If there's a way to recover." "There isn't," she said. "The property is gone. The restaurant is gone. The money is gone." Edmund covered his tracks well enough that even a good lawyer would have trouble. She paused. "But thank you for wanting to." "I'll find Aldridge on Monday," he said. "I'd like him to look at it anyway. He found what nobody thought he'd find with Patterson's case." She looked at him. "Ethan?" "Humor me," he said. "I find it very difficult to do nothing." "I know," she said. And she did, because she was exactly the same way, and the recognition of that between them was one of the things she had come to love most clearly. "All right." Aldridge looked at it on Monday. He spent 2 weeks with the documentation that Clara had, which was not much, but was something, and he came back with the news that Edmund Whitmore had in his haste made a technical error in the property transfer that created what Aldridge described in his precise legal manner as an interesting question worth pursuing. It was not a guarantee. It was not even a probability. It was an opening a small crack in something that Clara had considered sealed. She told Ethan that evening. "Well," Ethan said. "Well," she agreed. "Do you want to pursue it?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about Edmund Whitmore and his lawyer and the 43 cents. And she thought about what it would cost her in time and attention and emotional energy to go back and fight for something that was already past. And she thought about what her mother had always said about kitchens, that you could spend all your energy looking at what you'd lost, or you could spend it on what you were making. "I want Aldridge to pursue it," she said. "I want it on record that it was wrong. I want Edmund Whitmore to know that somebody looked at what he did and found the crack." She paused. "Whether anything comes of it, that's not what matters to me." Ethan looked at her steadily. "What matters to you?" She looked at the kitchen. At her kitchen with its reorganized shelves and her mother's book and the cup hook she'd installed herself and the particular warmth that a space acquires when someone loves it well. She thought about the dining hall full of men who had found their laughter again. She thought about Holt eating a full meal for the first time in 10 days, about Newcomb sitting straighter since the advance, about Thomas Patterson laughing with the younger hands. "This," she said. "What's already here?" Ethan reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because some things are past the point where words are the right instrument. The community dinner was her idea exactly as it had been in the original conversation, but the shape it took was something they built together. She proposed it on a Wednesday evening, and by Thursday morning, Ethan had talked to Garrett, and by Friday, Pete had ridden into Silver Creek with invitations that were really just the news passed person to person, the way news moved in small Texas towns that Callahan Ranch was opening its table on Sunday evening, and anyone who wanted to come was welcome. 11 people came the first Sunday. Clara cooked for 30, because she was a woman who had learned to cook for more than she expected, and she was not going to start underestimating now. They were a mixed group, a family with 3 children who had traveled 8 miles. 2 elderly brothers who ranched together, and had the bickering familiarity of people who had spent 60 years in each other's company. A widow who had come alone and spent the whole meal talking to Cole, with the absorbed attention of a woman who had not had anyone to talk to in a while. A circuit preacher who ate 3 helpings of everything and said grace with a spontaneous warmth that made even the least churchy of the cowboys bow their heads without being asked. Clara moved between the tables. She had set up 2 long tables in the dining hall to accommodate a group larger than the usual 32, and she listened and she watched and she cooked. She had spent the entire day preparing, and she had put Pete to work helping her in the kitchen, which had been his idea in the first place, presented as a casual offer, but which she recognized as the beginning of something. "You like this work?" she told him that Saturday as they were doing the preparation. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Not just helping," she said. "The cooking itself. You've been watching how I do things since the first week." He was quiet for a moment, peeling potatoes with the fast, unconscious efficiency he'd developed, and she waited because she'd learned that Pete needed a moment to decide to say the true thing, even when he already knew what it was. "My father thought cooking was women's work," he said finally. "I've been telling myself the same thing for 3 years, because it was easier than admitting he was wrong." "Is he wrong?" she said. "Yes, ma'am," Pete said. "Obviously." "Then stop wasting time," she said. "I'll teach you what I know. You'll learn the rest yourself. You've got good instincts better than you know." He looked at her with the particular expression of a 22-year-old who has just had something confirmed that he'd been afraid to believe. "You'd do that? Teach me?" "I'm already doing it," she said. "I have been for 3 weeks. I was waiting for you to notice." He laughed, a real surprised, completely natural laugh that bounced around the kitchen and made her feel entirely herself. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I reckon you were." The 11 people on the first Sunday became 23 on the second. By the third Sunday, they had 41, and Ethan had quietly arranged for 2 additional tables, and Garrett had organized 3 of the men to help with the serving, because Clara's kitchen was at full capacity, and he could see without being told that what she needed was hands, not supervision. The word spread the way good things spread in small communities, not loudly, not through announcement or advertising, but through the organic process of one person telling another that there was something worth going to. A woman named Frances Odom from Silver Creek told her neighbor who told her neighbor, and all 3 of them arrived together on the 4th Sunday and stayed 2 hours past what they'd planned and left with the slightly dazed expression of people who have been given something they needed without knowing they needed it. Cole's widow Clara had started thinking of her as Cole's, which she suspected Cole himself had also started thinking of her, as from the careful way he combed his hair on Sunday mornings now became a regular presence that Clara found herself looking forward to. Her name was Ruth. She was 58. She had a laugh that came from somewhere deep and genuine, and she had opinions about pie that were delivered with such confident expertise that Clara had spent an entire Wednesday afternoon adjusting her recipe based on them and found it improved. "Ruth thinks the crust needs more butter," Clara told Ethan one evening. "Ruth is correct," Ethan said, and then looked mildly surprised at himself. "You've been tasting the pie," Clara said. "I have opinions about pie," he said, with a dignity that she found deeply endearing. "Tell me next time," she said. Before I've already made 4 of them. I didn't want to interfere. You're not interfering, she said. You live here. You eat pie every Sunday. That gives you standing to have opinions. He looked at her with the expression that had become her favorite of all the expressions she'd learned, the warm, slightly undone look of a man who keeps being surprised by the fact that someone is including him in things, that the inclusion is genuine, that it doesn't come with conditions. All right, he said. More butter. More butter? She agreed. The legal resolution with Victor Langley came on a Thursday morning in the 6th week after Aldridge had filed the document fraud motion. It came in the form of a letter from Langley's new lawyer. The old one had indeed parted ways with him as predicted, which Ethan read in the kitchen while Clara made coffee, and which, from the way his shoulders changed as he read it, she knew was what they'd hoped for before he said a word. It's settled, he said. Completely. Completely. He set the letter down. The document has been ruled fraudulent. The fraud charge will proceed, but Langley's lawyer has indicated he'll cooperate with the court in exchange for reduced proceedings. The eastern pasture is confirmed as Callahan land. He paused. Thomas Patterson's testimony was what the judge called determinative. Clara sat down across from him. She thought about Thomas Patterson, who had left the ranch 2 weeks ago with his debt cleared and his uncle's name restored, and the specific straightened-up dignity of a man who had done the right thing and found it survivable. He had shaken Ethan's hand at the gate and then turned to Clara and said, "Ma'am, I don't know what was in that sweet dish you made me the first night, but I think it's what started all this." And she had told him it was just brown sugar and pecans, and he'd said he reckoned it was something more than that. She thought he was right. "Ethan," she said. "Yes." "I want to write to my mother's sister," she said. "In Louisiana. I've been putting it off because I don't know why I've been putting it off. Habit, maybe. Keeping my head down." She looked at the recipe book on its shelf. "But I think my mother would want her to know I'm all right, that I found somewhere." She paused. "She might want to know you." He looked at her across the table. He looked at her with everything open, all the things he'd spent 5 years containing, and she held it without flinching, because she had been learning to hold it, and she was getting better at it every day. "Write to her," he said. "Tell her she's welcome here. Tell her—" He stopped. Then, with the careful honesty she had come to love most about him, "Tell her that her niece built something on this ranch that wasn't here before she came, and that we'd be glad to have her at the table." Clara felt the word "we settle" into her chest like something coming home. She wrote the letter that evening. The thing she had not been prepared for. The thing she had not thought to prepare for, because it was not in the category of things she had been managing or worrying about or building toward, was the morning she found Ethan in the kitchen before she arrived. It was the 8th week. She came in at 3:55, as she always did, and the stove was already lit. She stopped in the doorway. Ethan was at the preparation table with her mother's recipe book open in front of him, not touching it, just reading it, his coffee cup beside him, his hat on the particular concentrated expression he had when he was absorbing something that mattered. He looked up when she came in, and for one moment had the expression of a man caught doing something private, and then it resolved into something more straightforward. "I couldn't sleep again," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard you." "I lit the stove," he said. "I hope that's—" "It's good," she said. "Thank you." She went to the stove and checked it and added what it needed and stood there for a moment with her back to him, feeling the warmth of the iron and the warmth of the room and the particular warmth of knowing someone was sitting behind her reading her mother's handwriting at 4 o'clock in the morning because he couldn't sleep. And this was the place he came to when sleep failed him. "She writes the way you talk," Ethan said. She turned around. He was looking at the recipe book still. "My mother. Her instructions," he said. "The way she writes them. Direct. No extra words. Like she knows exactly who she's talking to and trusts them to understand." He looked up. "You write the same way. The notes you've made in the margins." Clara crossed the kitchen and stood beside him and looked at the page he was reading, A bread recipe, her mother's handwriting in the instructions, her own handwriting in the margin where she'd adjusted the proving time for the altitude difference between New Orleans and Central Texas. The two handwritings side by side, her mother's confident loops and her own tighter print together on the same page. She felt it arrive fully, the thing she had been moving toward since she first turned the recipe book over to May Douglas's kitchen table in Marston and decided to use it as proof of who she was. The thing she hadn't known she was moving toward until she was already there. This was what her mother had been saving the blank page for. Not a recipe, a life, a new page to write it on. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "All right. When I walked through your gate 8 weeks ago, I was surviving," she said. "I was managing one day at a time. I had made a practice of not looking ahead because looking ahead was how you found out how bad things were." She looked at the recipe book. "I am not doing that anymore." "No," he said. "I am looking ahead," she said. "I am looking quite a long way ahead, actually, and I would like to know what you see when you do the same." He held her gaze for a long, clear moment. "I see this kitchen," he said, "and those tables full of people on Sundays, and Pete learning to cook, and Cole making eyes at Ruth and Holt, finally sleeping through the night." He paused. "And you. Specifically and primarily you. At every point in whatever forward I can see, there you are." She felt it in her whole chest. "Then we agree," she said. "We agree," he said. He stood up from the table. He stood close enough that she could see all the things she'd learned in his face, the tiredness that was honest rather than defeated, the warmth he'd stopped hiding, the specific quality of attention he brought to her that was different from how he looked at anything else. He raised his hand and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that was entirely inconsistent with the practical, efficient, hard-working man she'd arrived to cook for, and entirely consistent with the man she had been watching emerge from behind those walls for 8 weeks. "Clara Whitmore," he said. "Ethan Callahan," she said. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "Not because you're good for this ranch, though you are. Not because you've solved every problem I had, though you've solved most of them. Because I have been a man going through the motions of a life for 5 years, and I did not fully understand that until you walked through my gate with your mother's recipe book and your 43 cents and looked directly back at the men outside my saloon until they looked away first." He paused. "Because you make me see things clearly that I had made a practice of not seeing. Because I would rather have difficult truths from you than comfortable silences from anyone else." Another pause shorter. "Because I love you. And I believe that is sufficient reason." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the Texas sky was beginning the slow shift from full dark toward the particular deep blue that came just before dawn, and somewhere in the pastures, the cattle were moving with their slow morning rhythm. And in an hour, the bunkhouse would come alive, and Pete would appear in the kitchen doorway, and Cole would make his unhurried way to the dining hall, and the whole ordered warmth of a day on Callahan Ranch would begin. But right now, it was still just before all of that. Just her and Ethan and the stove and her mother's recipe book and the blank page waiting at the end of it. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that she felt as much as heard. "Yes," she said again, "because once wasn't enough for something this true. Because I walked into your gate planning to survive the winter, and instead I found something I didn't know I was looking for. Because you are the hardest and fairest and most honest man I have ever known, and being around you makes me want to be all of those things more completely myself." She looked at him steadily. "Because I love you. And you're right. That is entirely sufficient." He kissed her. It was brief and certain, the way he did most things once he decided to do them, and when he pulled back, he was looking at her with that expression that had become her favorite, and that she intended to keep seeing for the rest of her life. "4 o'clock, she said. 4 o'clock, he agreed. "The stove needs another log," she said. He added the log. She opened her mother's recipe book to the blank page at the back. She took a pencil from the preparation table. She wrote at the top of the page in her own tight print, Silver Creek, Texas. Callahan Ranch. The beginning of what comes next. She did not write a recipe. She wrote his name, then hers beside it. Then she closed the book and put it back on its shelf where it belonged, and turned to the stove and began the breakfast that would feed the people who were without her, quite marking the exact moment. It became true, her people. The men who had given her their trust, one meal at a time, the young man who was becoming a cook, the old man who was becoming something like a father to her without either of them acknowledging it directly, the widow who had strong opinions about pie, the strangers who arrived on Sundays and left feeling less like strangers than when they came. She cooked, and when the men filed in at 5:45, with the habitual comfortable noise of people who know they are walking into somewhere warm, and Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway, with his sleeves already rolled up ready to help, and Cole came in last as he always did, and looked at Clara, and looked at Ethan, sitting at the head of his table, and looked back at Clara with those sharp 62-year-old eyes that had seen everything and missed nothing. Clara met his gaze and gave him the smallest nod she had. Cole sat down. He picked up his coffee. He looked satisfied in the deep, thorough way of a man whose read of a situation has proven correct in every particular and who has the good grace not to say so out loud. He didn't need to. The woman who had arrived at the Callahan Ranch gate 8 weeks ago with 43 cents and a worn recipe book and the determination to survive one more day was not surviving anymore. She was living, fully and on purpose, and with both hands in a kitchen that was hers, and a life that was hers, and a table that was always set with one more place than the last time, because that was what she did. She made room. She fed people. She reminded them that they mattered. She built warmth in places that had gone cold, and she kept building it every single day without stopping. That was her mother's legacy. That was her own. And every morning when the kitchen fire came alive, and the smell of good bread filled every corner of Callahan Ranch and drifted out into the Texas air, the people of Silver Creek knew, without needing to be told, that the woman they had once underestimated was still there, still cooking, still paying attention, and that the richest ranch in Texas was rich now in every way that actually counted,